Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. And let's begin. Inherited this diner from my parents, and have spent practically my whole life in this town aside from the rare trips to nearby events, markets, state fairs, etc. But those are really only reserved for special occasions, and I don't mind that. I enjoy the peace and quiet that comes with my lifestyle, and I can't deny that as far as lives go, I happen to have myself a pretty good one. I have wonderful friends, the sweetest husband, and a beautiful baby girl named Kate. But as nice as my life is to me, I can't deny that it's also real slow. Not many big things have happened to me, if y'all understand what I'm saying. And so whenever an unknown face walks into my diner, I ask them if they have any stories to tell me. And if they do, I'm always more than happy to give them a discount on their meal. I've been doing this since I was 22, so about 10 years now. Okay, I'm going to admit something a bit embarrassing to y'all. The reason I had when I first started to do this was that I had recently found out about the notion of cryptids, and I thought the concept was pretty damn cool. More specifically, I thought people viewing me as a cryptid would be pretty damn cool. You know, some girl in some diner in the middle of nowhere that you end up spilling your darkest secrets to, and then never see again. Wouldn't that be a kind of neat way to be perceived? Well, my spooky little young adult self thought so, and that's where it all began. Normally people are quite hesitant to talk at first. However, they tend to warm up to the idea after I remind them not only will we likely never cross paths again, but I don't care about what kind of story they tell me. Whatever they feel like talking about, I'll listen to. I just want a break from the monotony of small town life. And boy, have I heard it all. Love affairs, childhood traumas, crazy deathbed confessions heard by nurses, the story of a very intoxicating and very hush-hush 2-month relationship a customer had with another woman in college before she tragically passed in an accident that she's never told a soul about since. Especially not her very Catholic now husband. But besides all that jazz, there's one type of story I keep being told. Horror. Now I get why this is. Ghost stories, supernatural crap, whatever you want to call it. That's the kind of thing people are hesitant to talk about. And in my opinion, half of it is because that's the kind of thing people are hesitant to believe. But who cares if you tell it to me? You're not going to see me again, so what's the harm in finally telling someone? It even wouldn't matter if I didn't believe them. They'd still get the discount. But I do believe the stories people tell me. It's something in their eyes, I think. When I look into them, I can see they're being haunted by something awful. And I think it helps them to talk about it. To leave here with the knowledge they're not carrying that burden alone. And carrying it with them is something I'm thankful I get to do. I listen to their stories, bring them sweet tea and dessert to cheer them up afterwards. I'll hold their hands if they'll let me, and just generally try to help them. It's one small way I can make an impact on some people who are really hurting, being the kind stranger they can confide in, knowing that they'll be believed. But anyways, I've told my husband some of these stories over the years, and he recently started browsing this subreddit, and mentioned to me that I should think about sharing some of them with y'all. And so here I am, sitting in my comfy chair, after my baby girl finally fell asleep with my laptop, and my absolutely darling cat, Cinnamon. I really do hope you guys enjoy the story I decided to share today, and I'll probably post some more soon. It was about 5 years ago now. I think this happened sometime in early July, so it was just after my 27th birthday. A young woman stumbled into the diner. I guess she was maybe a few years younger than I was. 23 maybe? Well, the poor thing looked like she hadn't properly slept in weeks. With eye bags so dark I had to take a moment to figure out if they were actually black eyes. She sat down at a booth, and I came over to pour her some coffee, which she gratefully accepted. I took her order, waffles with powdered sugar and a side of mixed fruit, and moved to sit down across from her. Instead of asking if she had stories to tell, I decided to ask her if she was all right, as the way her eyes shifted around the room, and the way her hands trembled so violently as she tried to use the cutlery, made me nervous that she was in some sort of danger. She looked at me and her eyes began to water, and in the softest voice you could ever imagine she just told me that I wouldn't believe her. It was here where I explained some of the parts of my game, focusing on the fact that there's really no harm from talking about it if she wanted to. Our paths would probably never cross again. I remember the way she looked down at the table, as her hands moved to scratch quite violently at the skin on her arms, which were just covered in long red marks already. My heart absolutely ached at the sight, but I decided not to say anything for the time being, though it took everything in me not to reach over and take her hands away and hold them myself. Finally she sighed and met my gaze as she nodded ever so slightly at me. She told me she had a stalker, and not one she thought was human. The first time she saw him was a few months prior, when she was walking to her dorm alone one night, back when she lived right by the Appalachian Mountains. She had gone out with some friends, and didn't realize how late it had gotten, and by the time she had started to make her way home, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The fastest way to get home meant she had to use a small path that cut through the woods, and she told me she was too worried about the big test she had to get home to study for, to really think about the dangers of walking through there at night. As she walked, she said she got that awful feeling that she was being watched, and out of nowhere she was hit with this horrific wave of anxiety, that her heart began to race like a scampering jackrabbit, and she broke into a cold sweat, and then she noticed it watching her through the tree line. It was tall and vaguely man-shaped, although she said she would hesitate to call it that, and by tall she meant inhumanly tall, roughly 7 or so feet by her guess. Its skin was a sickly pale, and its eyes were bloodshot, accompanied by an impossibly wide grin that revealed way too many horribly stained teeth. From what she could see, the thing was completely hairless, and was dressed in camouflage-type clothing, the kind that hunters in the military wear. She said that she froze up when she saw it, staring at the thing in absolute horror, and it just stayed there, smiling at her. Eventually she snapped out of it and bolted, yet the thing made no move to follow her. All it did was turn to face her and continue to smile as she ran off. She told me that when she got back to her dorm, just got this sudden urge that she was going to be sick. And this was super weird, since the girl had only thrown up twice in her life. Once when she got a really bad case of the flu, when she was 10, and once when she got a little too drunk at a party in high school. Yet she had spent the next 10 minutes throwing up everything in her stomach, and the next 20 dry, heaving over the toilet. Her roommate had rushed in to find her covered in sweat and violently sobbing as she threw up for no apparent reason. She had tried to tell her about the thing that she saw in the woods, but her roommate had told her that she was probably just sick with something, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She said that night she had supposedly had these beyond horrible nightmares, and her roommate told her the next morning she had woken up screaming for separate times. That was her first encounter with the thing, but it certainly wasn't the last. At this point she had begun hyperventilating, tears ran down her cheeks, and a strangled cry wrenched itself from her throat. I quickly ran over to the counter to get her some napkins and a glass of water, before I finally gave in and grasped her shaking hands and held them tightly. I had asked her if she wanted to stop, but she just shook her head, and so I held her hands and waited for her to continue with her story. She said she realized pretty quickly that whatever it was came with the night. At first, she genuinely had just believed she had come down with some kind of awful virus, but when she woke up the next morning shaken and exhausted, but by all other means healthy, she was very confused but didn't really know what else to do. Then email her professor to explain her situation, and sit on her couch and watch episodes of her favorite show while she apparently clung onto her roommate for dear life. That was until nightfall came around, and she saw the thing again, and this time it was watching her from her living room window. Instead of freezing up again, she just started to scream, and when her roommate rushed over to see what was wrong, she looked out the window and went pale as a ghost. She asked her roommate if she was seeing it too, and she just nodded before dragging her out of sight from the thing's view and calling the cops. Her symptoms immediately came back, the vomiting, the panic attack-like behavior, the sweating, all of it just like the night before. For some reason though, her roommate was completely unaffected, shaken sure, but no sickness, no nightmares, nothing, just like the few other people after that who saw it when they were with her, although nobody ever saw it without her. And then the police showed up, and things got even worse. They couldn't brush her concerns off, even in the state she was in. Her perfectly healthy roommate had seen it too, and so they began to look into things, and what they found was absolutely nothing. The thing couldn't be seen on the security camera footage, right beside where it had been standing. They couldn't find a record of any person matching its description in their databases. No matter how many times she called over the next 3 months, no matter the situation, no matter if there was another person there who insisted they saw it too, they couldn't find any evidence of it being there, or any record of its existence. She went to a psychiatrist who determined she didn't seem to be suffering from any sort of psychotic disorder, and other doctors at the local hospital ran every test they possibly could to explain her symptoms. Head CT scans, MRIs, they all came back totally clean. She had no head trauma, tumors, or any type of head injury that could be causing hallucinations. Her blood tests showed there was no autoimmune disease that could explain the symptoms. She did gastric emptying scans and other similar tests, which eventually confirmed there was no disorder that could explain the vomiting. The symptoms never happened during the day, during testing, or in any other situation. She never got sick, had any other type of nightmare or hallucination. She just kept seeing whatever the hell that thing was, and getting violently ill. Eventually she decided to just try her best to stay inside after dark, which worked for a while until the night when everything went very wrong. She had gone to a local cafe to get some homework done and accidentally fell asleep at her computer, and had woken up to one of the waitresses gently shaking her awake and telling her it was closing time. Their closing time was 10 p.m. The sun had set over an hour ago. Her hands started to shake more violently than they already were, which I didn't even think was possible, and she choked back another sob before she continued to speak. She dug through her backpack to find her pocket knife and tucked it into her jacket sleeve before she began to brave her way through the darkness back to her house. The cafe was only a 10-minute walk with the shortcut, 20 if she stayed on the streets. She considered her options for a moment, trying to figure out which was more dangerous. She eventually decided that while the streets would take longer, they were better lit, and maybe still had some people out. It wasn't that late, but this wasn't exactly a college town either. There wasn't exactly a nightlife besides 1 or 2 bars. Odds were that she could make the whole trip and run into less than a dozen people. She had made it 10 minutes before she got the feeling she got on the path again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched coupled with cold sweats and horrible anxiety. She slipped her knife out of her jacket into her hand and held it out in front of her as her gaze shifted to the nearby alleyway. And there it was, tall and pale as death, with the same bloodshot eyes and smile with too many teeth, and that same damn camouflage outfit it always seemed to wear. Only this time it also held something else, a bouquet of wilted flowers. As the thing held them out to her, she turned and bolted down the street, all thought of defending herself from that thing long forgotten. This time, though, it dropped the flowers and took off after her, and this was the first time she realized just how fast it actually was. She told me she had always been a good runner. She did track in high school and even made the state finals, and this was without a doubt the fastest she had ever run in her life. But this thing somehow caught up to her in a matter of seconds, and then it reached out and grabbed her shoulder. At this she took her hands away from mine and pulled down one of the sleeves of her yellow cardigan, revealing her bare shoulder, and my breath caught in my throat. On her shoulder was a large scar resembling the shape of a hand, palm on the shoulder itself, the outline of long fingers marking the top of her arm. My first thought was about the time I was 17 years old and saw a story about a woman who had acid thrown on her face on TV. It looked almost like that, but if a person with inhumanly long hands somehow managed to cover their own hand in acid without injuring themselves and gripped her shoulder as hard as they possibly could, or maybe like a third-degree burn in the shape of a hand, like if it was from a person who was made of pure fire. She sniffled softly, which pulled me out of my thoughts. In a whispered voice, she told me that the doctor said whatever burned her ate away the fat and a good portion of the muscle in that shoulder. She can barely lift that arm now. As the tears ran down her face, she talked about how the pain she felt in that moment was like nothing else she'd ever felt before. She couldn't even describe it. She remembered collapsing to the ground screaming bloody murder, and right before she blacked out, she said she saw the thing lean over her. And with that horrible smile still on its face, it hissed out one word to her: soon. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Even after the wound healed, the pain never stopped and never got better. And that was it. That was the final straw for her. She withdrew from college, packed up her things, and moved states to live with her parents again. And for 1 week things seemed to be okay. She thought maybe it didn't follow her here. Until a bouquet of the same wilted flowers and an empty chocolate box stuffed to the brim with human teeth and fingernails appeared on her parents' doorstep. It got closer after that, more and more bold, until the night when it actually knocked on her window, banging on the glass with an almost maniacal frenzy until the police arrived. By that point, of course, there was nothing there, not a trace. Since then, she's just been driving around the country. Her parents have been sending her money for food and motels. She figured that if it took a week to get from her old town to her parents' house, and only seemed to come out at night, then maybe she could keep ahead of it if she just kept moving. After a moment of stunned silence, I asked if I could hug her and rushed over to pull the shaking girl into my arms as soon as I got a nod of approval. I spent the next half hour gently stroking her hair as she sobbed into my shirt. I wanted to help this poor girl so badly, but deep down we both knew there was nothing I could actually do to keep her safe. But I told her the meal was on me, and I took her back to my house. It was still light out after all, so I figured it was safe. I let her take a long shower and helped bandage up her arms, made her dinner, and introduced her to my cat. And then I cut up some fruit and placed it in Tupperware containers along with some cookies and gave her directions to the nearest motel. I still think about that girl all the time. It's been half a decade, and I haven't heard anything about her since. I don't know if she was taken by that thing or if she managed to outrun it, but I still pray every single night that one of these days she'll walk back into my diner and tell me the story of how she defeated that monster over more waffles covered with way too much powdered sugar and a side of fruit. Just in case I don't make it away from this thing, I'll leave this for an explanation. I am, as my father was before me, a man whose collar could compete with the sky's hue. My calloused hands are a testament to that. With a stature that could rival some ball players and a lack of aptitude for education, I was a football coach's star child, though unfortunately my NFL dreams are far behind me. Taking advantage of what God gave me, soon after high school I worked construction, where from dusk to dawn I slaved till my back begged for a reprieve. Nevertheless, I wasn't taught to complain, and I never did. Somebody had to lay down supports, and the job didn't get finished quicker by whining. After a quarter of my life passed, I soon realized that as much as I wanted to hold true to my father's ideals, my body was ready to call it quits. Hearing about an opening in a trucking company from a friend, I seized the opportunity without even a second thought. I'll never forget the feeling I got from stepping high into that seat and watching how the beast came alive. The rumbling under my feet from the cab's humongous engine slowly began to be my comfort as I passed from province to province. Aside from my dog, of course, I found him as a mangy lab whose skin practically stretched over its ribs. The animal was uniquely dark, could probably disappear when night falls, and its eyes matched its striking appearance. They seemed to always look for something to explore. Seeing the state it was in, I'd be heartless not to give it a place to eat. Since then, it had been my support throughout most of my hardships. I'd grown accustomed to running my hands through its fur instead of pouring my sorrows into a drinking cup. And without change, here that same dog was accompanying me on another outing. Making sure I had everything I needed in the cab, food, water, and the such, I turned to the dog curled up in my seat. As I gave him a soft pat, the truck came to life, and so we began the trip. As usual, the drive didn't come with much entertainment. I watched tirelessly as car upon car passed by on the sun-beaten pavement. My one break in the noise was the sunset spreading out colors of red, purples, and yellows. Even so, that was quickly replaced by stars laid across the night. I leaned back in the leather seat and laid my hands behind my head. Before I knew I was sleeping, I woke up. To my shock, flat grassland had been replaced by trees that seemed to block out the moon, and between them, no light escaped. The vast warped branches spanned out, almost touching the asphalt of the road. The only thing I could clearly see was the path in front of me. Still half awake, I quickly took notice of my dog's whines, pulling over on the side of the road and letting the animal out to go do its business. As I viewed from the agape door, the dog made its way from the rocks deep into the cover of the tree line. I turned my head away and began scrolling on my phone. Worry began to settle after 15 minutes ticked past. I let out a whistle. "Here, boy, let's get out of here." For a few moments, the only thing that greeted me was the impasse of bark and foliage cloaking whatever may hide behind the surface. Then, as if on schedule, my dog clambered out of a break in the tree line. "Where have you been, buddy?" I chuckled softly. I was worried sick. The second its ears perked up to the sound of my voice, the animal became rigid. His body turned to me like he was attached to a spinning rod. A dead stare that went right through me matched my gaze. It sent a shock down my spine. It was out of character for the thing to move so strictly. My dog held the same unwavering stare, and with every second passing, I could feel my heart pound harder in my chest. Then, he opened his mouth and began to let out this guttural moan. It was deep, quiet, and alien. Ignoring the primal voice screaming to get out of there and quick, I gave a look to the animal standing more still than the deep pine beside it, illuminated only by the light of the truck cab. It was a howl, I rationalized. Dogs do that. For the first time in God knows how long, I took my eyes away from the tree line, and onto the clock I kept on my dash. Before I could even make out the numbers on the clock, I saw in my peripherals something that sent fear down to the core of my heart. I slowly turned my head, and as if to confirm the feelings of horror, my whole body turned to ice. Upright on my two legs, and without breaking the leer it again began to vocalize. Where? It let out in the same jarring tone. Have. It spoke with long pauses between the letters, and it stretched out the vowels. In that moment, no matter how big I was, or the size of the truck, a primal feeling of being some animal's prey struck every bone in my body. I slammed my door shut as it sounded out the word you. As though he clocked in on my escape plan, it began making its way towards with its two back legs. Not once taking those eyes off me, it leaned back and forth as it stepped, increasingly upping the speed. I finally took heed of the voice screaming at me to run, and pressed the monstrous car to the highest speed it could go. And though I expected it, dread still wormed its way through me, as I saw the animal in pursuit in my rear view. Albeit slow enough to give me enough time to stop at a motel and collect my thoughts. That's where I'm at now writing this. I'm watching and waiting in case that thing figures out how to open doors. I don't think regular human beings are prepared to come face to face with what was, what is, and what is to come, all in the same teary-eyed, naive, thoughtless gaze. It's too much for our small minds to handle, I think. I've experienced that once or twice in this lifetime. Taking a Michigander and shipping him off to a foreign land where nobody knows anything about you except your last name and rank can be overwhelming to say the least. It may be nihilistic of me to think so, but listening to the sounds of artillery rip your friends to shreds, hearing them call for God, their mother, or any other variety of final requests they may make, knowing their demise is nearing with every second, puts the value of individual lives in perspective. By the time the black suits and billionaires decided the fighting was done, and I was sent home, I had nothing but a small satchel of personal effects, used battle rags and nightmares. I had forgotten what it was like not to sleep on 4-hour intervals trading time with a fearful, wide-eyed kid from the Bronx, or a too-cool-for-school black kid from the South, with the occasional appearance by the freckle-faced kid from down the street that enlisted with you, hoping he wouldn't die alone in a trench full of strangers, which of course he did. Either way, I made it home in one piece. On the morning of July 26, 1959, 15 years after my return home from the Pacific, my clammy hands making the ink of the morning paper bleed onto the countertop as I stood wide-eyed, taking in the absolute horror of a story that I had found nestled between the personal ads and the sports section. It would be a falsehood for me to say the small voice in my head wasn't pleading to the universe, that it was fiction with every word my brain tried desperately to process as I scoured the story, which stretched nearly the entire page. A new recurring column, perhaps? As if the world wasn't full of enough horror, at least for the working-class Joes like myself. The story detailed the gruesome journeyings of a couple of green, naive kids from my hometown. According to the story, on August 16, 1936, a Sunday, the boys were experiencing the standard end-of-summer blues and wanted to finally do something daring. More daring than sneaking out or making prank calls like most 15-year-old boys do. On that day, these two young men decided to poke around one of the two abandoned copper mines located on the outskirts of my hometown, Copper Hollow, Michigan. The town was cleverly named for the copper mines, which were first discovered by miners from the northeast who followed the large river that ran through my town down south. The mines provided a huge economic boom for the area, and Copper Hollow quickly sprawled into what it is today, which is still a small town by most people's standards. Unfortunately for the mining industry, both of the mines were closed down in the early aughts under circumstances that rang mysteriously, to say the least. I remember my father telling me at the time that a lot of the miners were getting sick, not from the mining itself, but from something else down there. A lot of the guys that descended into the sprawling depths of the mines came back different, to say the least. Many of them would be committed to the asylum up in Traverse City, but even more would just starve themselves to death without the courage to kill themselves off quickly, and with too much fear to continue living. My father said that it was all a bunch of ghost stories to keep people out of the mines. Officially, many thought the workers went on strike, being miners at the time made very little and never returned. Others thought the copper ran dry. Many that were close to the workers who were laid off at the time of the mines closing all claimed that there were other, far more powerful and sinister things at play that forced its closure. Nevertheless, the mining ceased and the formerly mineral-rich ground was sealed forever, or so I thought. According to the article, the workers, in a craze, boarded up all of the entrances except for one. This specific mine shaft was one of the first to be closed down, and was forgotten when the rest were sealed up. I remembered the initial story back in the 30s almost immediately. It was unclear to the authorities which of the two boys decided to convince the other to explore the abandoned mine, or which one of them objected, if they objected at all. If you're superstitious like me, the first thing you'd wonder is what possessed these two young boys, who grew up hearing about how dangerous the mines were, and how eerie the circumstances of their closing were, to one day decide to venture into their abyssal depths. The article went on to recap from its initial story that despite the best efforts of law enforcement, of course, only one of the two boys, a kid named Billy McKinnon, a young Irish fellow a few years younger than myself, made it safely back to the surface. The child was immediately rushed to the asylum 50 miles north of here for questioning, babbling on about some of the most horrifying things you've ever heard. From the beginning they tried their best to pin a murder on Billy. The case had two major problems, the first being that no corpse was ever found, and the second being that police were convinced by the insane babblings that he made from the moment of his capture, that he not only didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but didn't hold the mental capacity necessary to stand trial for murder. They shipped him off to the asylum in Traverse City, where he remained until today. The story indicated that after all this time, after years of authorities from multiple agencies contacting him, trying to get closure for the Jacobs family, a family I'd known through other acquaintances, he had finally decided to come forward with his portion of the story, to clear his name, and agreed to finally speak to authorities. A week after reading the article, I ran into a family friend of mine by the name of Archie Rucker, now a detective, who informed me he was in the fluorescent-laden room when the now 38-year-old Billy was being questioned. Initially, according to Archie, Billy seemed too scared to talk, but once pressured, he gave a full account of the events that took place, and even now I find it hard to comprehend exactly what Archie told me was said. To make sure they got everything, they brought in a stenographer from downstate, near Mount Pleasant, I think. Under the table, Archie sent me a copy of the transcript. This is what they were able to type out between the babbling and groaning from McKinnon. On the morning of August 16, 1936, my best friend in the whole world, Alex Jacobs, and myself, decided that we were bored. To us, we were far more bored than any of the other kids in the neighborhood, whose parents had spent hundreds of dollars on toys, vacations, and expensive frozen desserts to beat the heat of the Midwestern summer. We were broke, with only a few cents for the occasional Coca-Cola, a couple of comic books, a deck of worn playing cards, and the type of vivid, at times explicit imagination, that ranged from deciding whether the Three Stooges or Popeye would win in a fight to observing how much bigger Laura Crowley's chest had gotten over the last year. Boy stuff! In the shadow of the morning sun, we talked over the activities for the day, beginning with riding our bikes along the same trails of the town square, buying an ice cream soda from the creepy corner store owner they see every day for groceries anyhow, strolling the park, or doing something different, something fun, something dangerous. Honestly, a part of me wanted to one-up Alex on the toughness scale, and another part of me didn't understand what we were agreeing to, or understand the powers that be that aligned our destinies on this sunny, perfect morning. Regardless, somehow, we agreed to explore one of the abandoned copper mines, a former source of prosperity, peace, and happiness that slowly turned into a cesspool of legend and mystery. The first mine was out of the question. Unlike the haphazard exit of the second mine, the first had been demolished using dynamite when it was shut down to avoid anyone ever entering. Plus, that mine didn't come with the shock factor the second mine had. The second mine was the one that carried the stories of ancient power, political and economic corruption, and the allure of a dangerous, daring adventure. I'm sure you can understand that a lot of this is a blur to me. I don't remember which, but one of us decided on the second, and the other quickly agreed. The forgotten entrance we decided to use was a long-time hangout of some of the older teenagers, ne'er-do-wells, and miscreants for as long as I can remember. On this particular day, the entrance to the mine was untouched and unguarded, which left a perfect opportunity for us to not only enter the mine unbothered, but also unseen and undetected by the watchful eye of anyone who would try to stop us if they saw us. The entrance to the mine began small enough that we had to duck to get inside, but then opened up into a large towering cavern, lined with railroad ties, rope and nails, the diameter of $1 piece, a sturdy piece of architecture to be sure. My father is a steelworker, so I stole a couple of his big flashlights to make sure we didn't go in blind. I knew he wouldn't miss them. We wouldn't be gone that long. When I first entered the mine, turned on the flashlight and looked around, I felt the eagerness of a child on his first Christmas. My eyes ran rampant across the fixtures of rock and wood beams, taking in every inch of the caverns, memorizing their position, taking everything in. This was in part driven by the fear of getting lost in the unexplored territory, and part eagerness to find the next portion of the tunnel that led deeper into the mine. Alex was the first to find the next tunnel, to the left of where we entered, in a seemingly obvious part of the cavern. He approached it first, slowly, flashing his light inside to illuminate, even if ever so slightly, the path ahead, and he entered with extreme caution to explore the next room. I followed him closely, feeling a lump in the back of my throat. It was very odd, being that I didn't necessarily feel fear, but I knew I had no idea where the tunnel led. Along the tunnel floor there lay pickaxes, barrels of safety equipment, rope, and crates of rock that appeared to contain a shiny ore. I thought to myself at that moment, it was a bit peculiar, even if the miners rushed out, to leave the equivalent of unclaimed money laying in the halls of the mine shaft. But honestly, I didn't think too much beyond that. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. It felt like we were walking for ages. My feet began to get tired, and I felt the overwhelming urge to ask Alex to turn back and leave with me. At that moment, I felt a stronger urge to continue exploring. It reminded me a lot like the anticipation of going on a vacation or to a football game, something that I'd looked forward to for a long time. As we entered deeper into the mine without thinking about it, I felt the ceiling get shorter and shorter. This continued until we were waddling like ducks along the floor of the tunnel. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a large stone room. The walls were smoothed down, as if it were intentionally built at the end of this tunnel. What was odd, and unsettling to say the least, was the lack of edge to anything in the room. Even the corners that led to the floor had a rounded edge to them, and even more, the entire room seemed to be made of one solid stone. Alex and I both stared in awe at the room around us, and it took us a moment to finally realize that at the far end of the room lay a large stone structure. We slowly approached it, initially thinking it was some sort of makeshift break area for the miners, but it wasn't. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was clearly much older than the mines, and truthfully, much older than anything I'd ever seen in real life. It reminded me of some of the ancient Egyptian and Mayan structures you'd see in National Geographic. I walked toward the base of the structure, and I saw something that, even now, is extremely odd. There was a large book, like the kind you see in the library, that has old newspapers in it. The great big books. This one was different, though. Instead of the standard brown cloth binding, this book was very ornate. The book itself was bound in a leather of some kind, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was black in color, but contained sparkles within it, like the kind of metallic paint you see on a car. It was mesmerizing. The odd part wasn't the book itself, interestingly enough. The odd part was that even though the book was clearly very old, perhaps hundreds of years old, there wasn't a speck of dust on it. It appeared to be brand new. I slowly lifted the heavy cover open and shined my light on the pages, written over and over on every page. For the entirety of the book were the words, written in a dark black ink. The great dreamer's reign is near. Be ye ready. As the book went on, the writing became fainter and fainter, as if someone sat down in front of the book and wrote out this phrase over and over, in one sitting, as if they were running out of ink. Suddenly, towards the end, the ink changed. It went from a dark black to a deep, viscous red. I quickly shut the book in horror. After that, I didn't know what to think. The thought of being in the cold, dark cavern, it was like I was feeling the tension of thousands of years of ritual and supernatural occurrences weighing me down, began to make my blood run cold. Everyone had heard stories of mysterious beings and energies dwelling deep within the mine, and this seemed to confirm that. It's very easy to see how horrifying it would have been to be in that place now. But in that moment, it felt like every second of my life led me to this moment of clarity, this moment of understanding, this moment of finally realizing my greatest purpose. It was like I'd wanted to be here my entire life, though I knew in the back of my mind that wasn't true. As we stood there for a moment in the complete silence and solitude of the underground cavern, suddenly Alex got my attention and directed it towards the ceiling, where an even larger structure jutted out from the wall, creating a large effigy. The carving, even now, I have a hard time describing. If you were to ask me what I saw, I would say that I saw the head of a large black squid attached to a human body with black scaly skin, posed as if climbing through the wall towards us. Its arms were stretched wide, as if almost embracing those in the room. The eyes were what terrified me the most. They were burning red, searing, as if they could see into my very soul. On the walls around us, we began to notice further carvings, which created the impression of wings. For a moment, just a moment in the dark, I could have sworn I saw it breathe. Even now, I wonder if I saw anything at all, or if my mind tried desperately to fill the void of some traumatic event or some underlying fear that I carried with me into the cavern. Another part of me knows for certain exactly what I saw there. We stood and marveled at the sheer architectural feat that the effigy was for a moment. It felt like we could stand there forever, taking in every painstakingly carved-out detail of the effigy. Out of nowhere, my ears began to focus on a sound coming from behind the stone structure. It sounded like the slow drip of a tap that wasn't completely shut off. I saw Alex look in the same direction I was, and flash his light that way. We walked around toward the back of the structure, using our hands to guide us along the smooth, cold limestone towards the source of the dripping. As we made our way around, there was a small opening in the rock, smoothed to a round edge, that led to a large staircase, the only right angles in the place, that led down into a dark abyss. Alex and I looked at each other, both of us scared out of our minds. "No turning back now," Alex said, his voice calm and confident, contrasting completely from his scared, timid nature that I had become familiar with over the course of our friendship. We nodded to one another and slowly made our descent into the depths of the abyss. Our flashlights at this point were no help, as they only seemed to show the next 10 stairs or so. We took each step slowly, carefully, never a step out of place. In the quick glances I took at the walls of the staircase, I noticed the same characterization of the effigy above in various scenes. The one I remember best was one of the effigy coming out of a large body of water. I don't remember more than that, but I know they lined the entire staircase. At this point, we had been climbing down deep underground for what felt like forever. If I had to guess, I would think we went down at least 10 to 12 stories. The dripping seemed to get louder and louder until it was almost like the sound of a waterfall. Finally, halls of the staircase opened up to a slightly larger room, smaller than the first cavern, but with the same smooth stone walls. In the center was a pool of water, maybe 6 or 7 feet in diameter, with a slow, soft drip coming from the ceiling dropping into it, making the sound. From here, the dripping sounded much calmer, much softer than in the staircase we had traversed. We approached the pool and shined our lights inside. It was the most beautiful, clear water I'd ever seen. At this depth, it even had a slight blue hue to it, like the ocean. Alex seemed much more enthralled by it than I, but it was extremely beautiful. The longer I looked at it, the more I wanted to touch the immaculate blue water. Suddenly, I became thirsty, thirstier than I'd felt my entire life. I'd have given anything for a Coke from the creepy corner store at the end of the block, or even the lukewarm water from the hose at home. But I knew for sure that the best water in the world was in that pool. My long, pasty white fingers slowly drifted down towards the water to retrieve a drink for myself. As they slowly, daringly approached, the feelings of desire for the water only grew. But before I could take a drink, Alex quickly placed both of his hands, making a bowl out of them, into the cold, dark water, pulled them up, and drank. Alex paused for a moment, his eyes wide, and he began to quickly gulp down the water like an animal. I didn't know what to do. Yes, the water looked good, and yes, I wanted to drink it. I don't know what it was about seeing him drink the dark, blue cave water, but it made all desires to drink the water fade away, as if they never happened in the first place. All I could feel in that moment was dread. It felt like I was waiting for something horrible to happen. It's like watching a horror movie, waiting for the inevitable entrance of a monster in the form of a jump scare. But this time, a monster didn't come. I couldn't watch him drink anymore, and turned away. In place of a monster, and I know this will sound crazy, a voice began to speak inside my head. For a moment I had to convince myself that it wasn't my own thoughts, but the thoughts of another, more powerful force. The voice was deep, gravely, and sounded like a demon if you put it through a distortion machine like they use for movies and in recording studios. The tone of the voice was somber and absolute, with the level-headed delivery that you'd expect talking to a deity. "Did you hear that?" I asked Alex, my eyes veering back to him for the first time since he drank the water. Alex was staring into the pool, unmoving. His attention focused completely on something moving in the water. "Alex, are you okay?" Silence. "This isn't funny, Alex. We need to go." I got up to leave, and he grabbed my wrist with strength I'd never seen from him before. He pulled me back to the kneeling position I had taken up next to the pool and turned to lock eyes with me, but they weren't his eyes. His eyes were a black void, a void that I can only liken to that of the backdrops of movies that take place in space. Absolute nothingness, no emotion, no empathy, just an endless void. Did you understand what the great old one said, Billy? Who? What are you talking about? You heard the voice. I replied, in this shrine the great dreamer's slumber has been interrupted. Alex, you're scaring me. It was at that moment that I noticed the long, thick, rope-like tentacles sticking out of the back of Alex's head. It was surrounded by a steady stream of crimson blood. In a flash, Alex's body was plunged into the pool, the entirety of him disappearing into its cold depths. I looked deep into the water, frozen in fear, trying to find any signs of life. Just as quick as he went into the water, I saw something begin to float towards the top of the pool. I slowly peered over the edge to get a better look, and suddenly I was face to face with my best friend, frantically trying to swim to the surface. I screamed for him. Oh, how I screamed for him. When he finally looked like he was about to crest the surface, he stopped. It was like he ran into a plate of glass. He started to bang his hands against it, and it was clear he couldn't get through. I wanted so desperately to just reach in and grab him, to rescue him, to save him. I wanted with everything in my heart, body, mind, and spirit to help my friend out of that pool, and to leave that place forever. I sat there frozen, willing my body to move, willing myself to reach in, grab his hand, and end this horrible adventure we had so innocently begun together, but could end with his death. His knocks became fainter and fainter, and I watched in horror as he fell deeper into the depths. As he descended into the darkness of the pit below, I could make out the faintest outline of a tentacle wrapping around him, dragging him down to his demise. A lot of what happened after that is a blur. I don't know if I screamed, cried, or did nothing at all. I don't remember how long it took me to traverse the staircase back to the large cavern, but when I reached the top is when I began to regain my full awareness of my surroundings. As I turned the corner around the large stone structure that led us to the staircase in the first place, I came face to face with a room of 20 or more hooded individuals, each holding a gas lantern, a flame enough for me to see the dark black metallic fabric of their robes, adorned with golden sashes. They began to chant in the same language I had heard in my head in the cavern below, and I prepared to meet a similar demise to my friend. Their tone was not that of a hostile force, nor that of a friendly one. Their tone was almost fearful, yet calm and accepting, like the prayers of a convict on their way to the gallows. I slowly began to make my way around the outside of the room, following the wall to the entrance Alex and I had used to enter the cavern. Once I found it, I ran as fast as I could down the tunnel toward the large cave we first entered through. When I finally got there after what felt like ages of running, my eyes found the tunnel with the faintest light pouring into it. My heart jumped as I quickly traversed it to the surface. As I felt the crisp, open air reach me, I closed my eyes to shield them from the afternoon sun. The clouds had passed. My eyes slowly began to adjust to the outside, my vision beginning to darken as I normalized the world outside of the mine. The horrible sight that my eyes saw as they opened can only be explained as demonic and unnatural. When I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but long, green pastures, land that stretched for miles beyond where my hometown once stood. Gone were the streets, the cars, the buildings, and most frightening of all, the people. Above me the sun was moving across the sky at a rate I could perceive with the naked eye, much faster than usual. As night came, the moon moved faster across the sky. The days began to fade by quicker and quicker, turning into months and years, all before my very eyes. I began to see structures emerge from the ground, blurs of people swirling around the new structures, the emergence of technology, and my hometown returning to the state it was when I left it. I felt like it seemed to freeze in that time for just a moment before the sun and the moon became even faster. The stars moving so quickly that the sky became white with starlight. At once, when the copper hollow that I knew and had grown up in had died away, with only the bones remaining in new, silver structures lining its freshly paved city-like streets, the curbs lined with small spaceship-like vehicles, the sky faded once again to dusk and stopped. To my right, along the river, the wide expanse of the river began to move as a large, horrifying being emerged from its depths. I can picture it so vividly, yet the words to describe it are unknown to me. I don't think that humans are ever supposed to see anything like that unless it's the last thing they ever see. The only thing I remember was a large black mass, shiny, scaly skin, claws, and a face of tentacles, but most of all, the huge blue and green eyes. The article concluded that just as Billy McKinnon was describing the horrible sight of the ferocious being he saw emerging from the river, on the date in question, he suffered a massive heart attack and died within seconds. With the new evidence, the police decided to search the mine again, using Billy's account as a roadmap to Alex's last known whereabouts. They found the large cavern that Billy talked about, but the book and the carving were missing. As they descended into the staircase, just where Billy said it was, behind a corner of rock, they found the pool. Next to the pool, with rope wrapped around his neck, was the body of Alex Jacobs, still wearing the same clothes he was reported to be wearing when he disappeared in 1936. Every inch of the corpse was inexplicably soaking wet. A part of me wonders if they heard a mysterious voice, all their lives, slowly whispering into their deepest recesses to convince them to venture in. Perhaps they were able to hold off such calls into the voids of the mine for years, their impressionable state as very young children, allowing them to buy into their parents' pleas to never enter there, but no longer. Perhaps some ancient force existed beneath the mines long before the first humans set foot in this land. Perhaps it was always meant to stay hidden within the hills and mountains, but the miners somehow discovered it and released it. If Billy is right, there is no stopping the force that lies in the depths of that mine shaft, or any other forces like it that have operated all around us for millions of years. From my very temporary short existence, it can be easy to infer that, if after all this time they've laid dormant outside of those few outliers who choose to tamper with it, that it will not threaten our species. Even if we were to threaten their incomprehensible power outright, the only path that our young naive species as a whole can go down, like Billy and Alex, will lead to the entirety of our consciousness screaming into an unanswering void, begging for the release of death and the blissful ignorance of such unknowable, unimaginable horrors that await within the black indifference of the universe beyond, the entities there, by their very existence alone, preying on the deepest, darkest fears of our race, fears that are so locked away deep within the fabric of our reality that we cannot pretend to understand or comprehend them. It was just another ordinary evening when I clocked out from the factory, worn from the day's labor. The air was brisk, a premonition of the approaching autumn as I made my way to my rusty pickup, eager for the warmth of my home and the comfort of my bed. Driving along the winding roads, the countryside was as silent as the grave, save for the crunching gravel under my tires and the low hum of the radio playing old country songs. It was a drive I'd taken countless times before, a lullaby in its familiarity. The cloak of darkness felt comforting, the loneliness of the road a respite from the world's chaos. And then I saw it. Out of nowhere, it appeared in the beam of my headlights, standing eerily still at the side of the road. A deer. At first I felt a jolt of surprise, followed by relief. Just a deer, a common sight in these parts. But as my eyes locked with its own, a chill ran down my spine. Its eyes were not the simple, innocent orbs of a forest creature, but something far more haunting. They were startlingly human, filled with an inexplicable depth that drew me in. As I slowed the pickup, half expecting it to dart away, it did something that made my heart thunder in my chest. With an uncanny grace it rose, standing tall on its hind legs, its gaze never leaving mine. My breath hitched as I stared at the spectacle before me, my mind racing to make sense of the impossible scene. Was it a trick of the light? Or maybe fatigue playing games with my perception? A deer standing on its hind legs? My tired brain struggled to comprehend. But there it was, a silhouette illuminated by my headlights, as real as the cold leather of my steering wheel. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. By the time I fumbled to switch on the camera, the deer had dropped on all fours and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there, heart pounding, the echo of that haunting gaze still imprinted in my mind. Finally, I shook myself out of my daze, the radio's crooning suddenly loud in the silent cab. I drove home, the image of the upright deer flickering in my rearview mirror. I told myself it was fatigue playing tricks on me. I was just tired, overworked. My mind was seeing things that weren't there. Yet, as I turned the key to my front door, the cold biting at my fingertips, I couldn't shake off the feeling that what I'd seen was real. I locked the door behind me, the house eerily silent, and looked out the window into the dark night. Out there, somewhere, was that deer, and with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, I realized my comfortable familiar world was no longer the same. And sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams of hauntingly human eyes, and a deer standing tall on its hind legs. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the deer was a persistent ghost at the back of my mind. I tried to dismiss it, tried to bury it under the monotony of work and the familiarity of home. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a product of exhaustion. But the universe had other plans. One evening, as I was returning home from the factory, I saw it again. its silhouette outlined by the setting sun, standing at the edge of the woods bordering my home. My heart sank as it slowly stood on its hind legs, just as it had that night. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that suspended silence, I felt my pulse quicken. The deer's gaze found mine, its eyes burning into me with a strange intensity. Fear gripped me in its cold embrace. It wasn't a trick of my tired mind, it was real. But how could it be? The deer's presence became a dark constant in my life. It began to appear more often, not only by the roadside, but within the confines of my safe, familiar world. I would catch glimpses of it lurking at the periphery of my yard, its eyes eerily reflecting the moonlight. It would be there when I woke in the early hours, standing unnaturally on its hind legs, watching my house from a distance. It was even in my dreams, its presence punctuating my restless sleep. It didn't behave like any deer I knew. It didn't startle at sudden movements or run away when I attempted to approach it. It just watched me, its eyes filled with an unnerving intelligence. It was as if it knew me, understood me in ways I couldn't comprehend. People started to notice my distress. My colleagues would ask if I was okay, commenting on my pallor and the dark circles under my eyes. My friends questioned me about my distracted state when we met at the local bar. I tried to express my fears, but how could I explain it? How could I put into words the irrational terror of a deer standing tall on its hind legs? It was ludicrous, so I laughed it off, attributing it to work stress and lack of sleep. But inside, I was anything but all right. The line between my mundane reality and the surreal presence of the deer was blurring. Each day was a battle between trying to forget and the fear of its next appearance. At night, I would lie awake, staring out my bedroom window at the shadowy forest line, my heart pounding with each rustle of the leaves. My world had narrowed down to the anticipation and terror of my next encounter with the deer. And so, the very thing I had considered a hallucination had invaded my reality. My home, my sanctuary, was under siege by a creature I didn't understand. Its eyes haunted my waking hours and infiltrated my dreams, making me question everything I had believed about the world and myself. The silent watcher in the night was there, always there, like a specter in the twilight. And with each encounter, I felt myself being pulled deeper into the heart of the mystery. Little did I know, the real nightmare was just beginning. My life, once so unremarkably simple, had spiraled into a restless obsession. The deer had turned from an unusual specter into my living nightmare. Its presence seemed to seep into my daily routines, the inexplicable terror of it gnawing at my sanity. Sleep had become an elusive friend. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind against the windows, would jolt me awake, my heart pounding with the thought, was it outside? Was it watching? Nights transformed into an exhausting vigil. My eyes glued to the shadowy expanse of the woods, searching for its silhouette. Work suffered as well. My hands, once steady and assured on the factory floor, now trembled subtly. Concentration was a thing of the past. My thoughts invariably drifted towards the enigma that had invaded my world. The camaraderie of my colleagues turned into concerned whispers and questioning glances. Relationships strained. My friends couldn't understand the sudden change. My constant distraction. My reluctance to join them for our customary Friday night drinks. Even my family grew worried. My mother's voice, usually filled with light-hearted chatter during our weekly calls, had taken on a tinge of worry. I wanted to tell them, wanted to spill out my fears, but the words wouldn't come. It was ridiculous, I knew. A man haunted by a deer. The absurdity of it would surely invite laughter, or worse, concern about my mental state. So I bottled it up, plastered on a fake smile, and assured everyone that I was just tired, a little stressed from work. But in the solitude of my home, I was a prisoner of my fear. I began to research, desperate for an explanation. I devoured articles about deer behavior, reached out to local hunters, even posted on online forums, narrating my experiences under the veil of anonymity. But nothing explained the deer's peculiar behavior, its unnatural stance, its unsettling intelligence. If anything, my attempts to find answers only heightened my anxiety. In my desperation, I installed cameras around my property. I thought if I could record it, get tangible proof, maybe I could find a way to deal with it. So I spent countless hours watching grainy footage, my heart jumping at the smallest movement. Yet the deer eluded my attempts to document it. It seemed aware of the cameras, its appearances growing less frequent and always just out of clear sight. It was as if it was mocking me, playing a cruel game with my sanity. I was sinking deeper into a pit of paranoia and obsession. My reality was blurring, the lines between my mundane existence and the supernatural presence of the deer growing increasingly obscure. I was losing myself to fear, each passing day chipping away at my resolve. As the shadows of my once peaceful home grew longer, I realized I was spiraling. The once dismissive fear had grown into a full-fledged paranoia. I was living a waking nightmare, my life a strange dance with a deer. And as the nights grew darker, so did my fear. The chilling anticipation of my next encounter with the deer, a constant terror gnawing at the edges of my sanity. My life had become a twisted echo of its former self. The familiar humdrum of factory noises, the comfortable solitude of my home, the hearty laughter of friends, all were now distant, smothered under the heavy shadow of my obsession. The deer, my silent tormentor, had consumed my every waking thought, and the dream-filled sleep that occasionally came was filled with visions of its haunting eyes. There were times I found myself questioning my sanity. Was I hallucinating? Was my tired mind conjuring this eerie apparition, making me dance on the strings of my own fraying sanity? I would stand before the mirror, staring into my haggard reflection, searching for a hint of madness in my own eyes. But all I could see was fear, raw, visceral fear of the unknown. It was a chilling realization, understanding that I had become obsessed with a creature I had initially dismissed as an illusion of fatigue. The once passive dread had morphed into an active pursuit, my life revolving around my next encounter with the deer. I continued to pore over articles and forums, the blue light of the screen becoming my constant companion during sleepless nights. I turned my home into a fortress, investing in more surveillance equipment, mapping out the deer's possible routes, and trying to predict its behavior. It felt like I was chasing shadows. My attempts to understand, to rationalize, to somehow control the situation only led to more frustration. The deer always seemed one step ahead, as if it was aware of my desperate attempts. But the terrifying ordeal was not just the deer or its unnatural behavior. It was the transformation of my own self, the man I was becoming in the face of this inexplicable terror. The constant dread, the insomnia, the paranoia, they were reshaping me, sculpting a new version of myself that I barely recognized. In my desperation for answers, for closure, I made a decision. I had to confront it, face it head on. It was a terrifying thought, meeting the source of my fears in the flesh. But the idea also held a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could end my nightmare. My days were spent preparing for the encounter. I gathered tools, flashlight, a knife for protection, and a courage I wasn't sure I had. I meticulously planned, charting out the ideal location and time based on my previous encounters. At night, I laid awake, my mind filled with countless scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. I saw myself standing in front of the deer, its human-like eyes staring into mine, its body towering on hind legs. The thought made my skin crawl, but I clung on to it. This was my fight, my chance to reclaim my life. As the day of confrontation neared, a strange calm descended upon me. My fear didn't lessen, but it mutated into a constant, pulsating dread, like a second heartbeat. I had no idea what I was walking into, no certainty of what I'd find, and the prospect was terrifying. Yet, amid the swirling chaos of fear and anticipation, a thought persisted. Perhaps my obsession, my relentless pursuit, was not just about the fear of the unknown, but a desperate plea for understanding. Understanding the deer, understanding my own fear, and ultimately, understanding myself. As the night of the confrontation descended, my heart pounded a war drum in my chest. The familiar landscape of my home felt alien under the moonlit sky. Each shadow seemed to stretch longer, each sound echoed louder, and within me, fear wrestled with resolve. Armed with a flashlight and a knife gripped tightly in my hands, I stepped outside, the cool air laced with an electric tension. Every crunch of the gravel under my boots felt amplified, each rustle of leaves a harbinger of the coming encounter. I made my way towards the woods, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the inky darkness. The trees stood silent, like spectral spectators to my trembling courage. As I tread deeper into the quiet, my senses were heightened, each shadow and sound a possible sign of the deer's presence. And then I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its form cloaked in darkness, yet unmistakable. The deer. I froze, my heart threatening to leap out of my chest as it slowly lifted onto its hind legs. In the face of my nightmare, my fear gave way to a strange sense of awe. It was a chilling sight, the deer standing upright, a silhouette against the muted moonlight. Its eyes found mine, a pair of glowing orbs filled with an intelligence that unnerved me. I approached, each step deliberate and slow. The deer remained still, its gaze never leaving mine. A part of me wanted to flee, to escape the terror that wrapped around me like a shroud. But I held on, pushing through the icy tendrils of fear. Why? I found my voice, my words but a whisper against the quiet night. Why are you doing this? The deer didn't react, it just watched me, its eyes burning into mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I was close now, close enough to see the heaving flanks of the deer, the dusting of frost on its fur. I stretched a trembling hand, my breath hitching as I touched the cold reality of my fear. It was a surreal moment, touching the creature that had turned my life into a waking nightmare. Its fur was rough against my fingers, its body solid and real beneath my touch, yet its standing posture, its gaze, they were as incomprehensible as ever. The deer didn't flinch, didn't retreat, it just stood there, watching me with those unnerving eyes, my hand resting on its body. It was as if it had been waiting for this, waiting for me. As I stood there, my fear receding into a sea of unanswered questions, I realized I was a part of something greater, something beyond my comprehension. My fear, my obsession, had led me to this, a strange communion with a creature of the night. I didn't get any answers, no closure or understanding. My confrontation didn't solve the mystery, it only deepened it, wrapping me tighter in its enigma. But as I turned to leave, my hand lingering on the deer before finally retracting, I felt a strange peace. I was still terrified, still lost in the labyrinth of my experience, but I had faced my fear, touched it, looked it in the eyes, and that in itself was a victory. Days turned into weeks, and then months, yet the mystery remained unsolved. My life was no longer the same. Every day held a silent anticipation, an underlying tension, the unvoiced question, when would I see the deer again? But the deer didn't reappear, its haunting presence, once a constant shadow, had vanished, leaving behind a chilling absence. My home returned to its peaceful solitude, the forest by my house merely a backdrop to my ordinary existence, no longer the stage for my midnight encounters. But I was changed. The terror had etched deep scars on my psyche, the residue of fear and undercurrent in my everyday life. The deer, even in its absence, continued to exist within me, a reminder of my descent into obsession and my confrontation with the inexplicable. My colleagues noticed the change. I was more withdrawn, my usual jovial demeanor replaced with a quiet introspection. They attributed it to work stress, never knowing the true reason behind my transformation. I didn't correct them. It was easier to let them believe the mundane explanation. At night, I found myself gazing out of the window, my eyes drawn to the edge of the forest. The deer was gone, but its memory wasn't. I would stand there, lost in the puzzle that had become my life, the vision of the upright deer forever etched in my mind. I never understood what the deer was, why it behaved the way it did. Was it a figment of my tired mind, an undiscovered species, or something more, a bridge between the world I knew and one I couldn't comprehend? I grappled with these questions, but answers remained elusive. The mystery was a puzzle with missing pieces, an enigma that evaded comprehension. I had to accept that there were things in this world beyond my understanding, experiences that defied explanation. But with acceptance came a certain peace. The fear that had once consumed me was now a silent companion, a part of my existence. I had confronted my nightmare, lived through it, and survived. The experience had changed me and transformed my perspective of the world and my place within it. So life went on. I resumed my routine and found solace in the familiarity of my job, the comfort of my home. The days turned into a monotonous blend of ordinary and extraordinary, the memory of the deer a scar on the fabric of my normalcy. And so my tale ended where it began, on a quiet, lonely road, under the watchful eyes of a million stars. I was a man changed, shaped by fear, haunted by an experience that defied understanding. I was left with a memory, a mystery, and a terrifying encounter that would forever remain an enigma. The story of the man and the deer was over, but the echo of its memory would resonate within me, a haunting melody to the tune of my changed life. The unknown still terrified me, but it was now a part of me, a chapter in the book of my life, forever imprinted on the pages of my existence. My name is Tom Owens. I am a retired worker for the Department of Agriculture, and I'm here to share with you a story that has been the source of much anxiety, many questions, and more sleepless nights than I would care to think about. This is but one of the strange things that happened to me during my time working as a timber and silviculture tech for the Forestry Service in Indiana. For a long time, I have held my silence about what happened in fear of what may become of me if I decide to tell this story. I was forced to sign paperwork stating I would forever keep it a secret. Well, today that silence will be broken. Having worked for the Forestry Service for almost 22 years, it's easy to say that a person need quickly learn to respect the forest and its inhabitants, animal or otherwise. A lot of the work involved would probably seem like pretty mundane things, such as marking out trees for timber and preparing locations for seeding and tree planting. A lot of my time was spent alone or in small groups. Bizarre things happened to me in both of those situations, and I can assure you that the feeling of safety in numbers really did not apply in my experience. I cannot recall the exact date when this story takes place, but I know it was early fall of 1988, and I had recently just celebrated my 38th birthday and had been living in Nashville for a couple of years by then. I had been teamed up with Henry Waite and new boy Stanley Holt to scope out timber to be harvested for firewood in the Brown County State Park, just off the Salt Creek Trail. Henry, a towering frame of a man who, at one time at least, would have looked like he could fell a tree with a single blow of an axe if he so wanted to, had been doing this work almost his entire life. He was maybe 3 or 4 years off retirement at this point. He had deep furrowed lines crossing about his face and forehead, which suggested a more than serious look about him, and had a deep gravelly voice that time had clearly softened. I had worked with him on a number of occasions in the 22 years I had under my belt with the service, and in honesty, I didn't mind the old-timer. I mean, he wasn't always the perfect coworker. He could be awkward when it came to making decisions, and there were times when I would be sweating my tail off moving equipment about only to find the guy sleeping in the cab of our truck. But I had to accept that the poor dude was nearly 70 years old, and had clearly done his share of manual labor in his time. I certainly had a lot more time for him than the others, it seemed. Henry used to have some really interesting stories. He used to tell others about stuff he'd heard out in the forest, and stuff he claimed to have seen too. Oftentimes he was alone when these occurrences took place, and the other workers never really paid him much attention, and generally would pass off his stories as mere scaremongering, verging on the ramblings of a senile old man. As for myself, I took his tales with a pinch of salt. Heaven knows you had to, otherwise you'd likely find yourself out alone one day, and hear something in the distance and end up totally crapping yourself and running back to your truck. Other than this, though, he never was one to talk all that much beyond small talk and chit-chat, but when he was recalling one of his stories he would come to life, so to speak, and really put a great show on. He was one hell of a storyteller, that's for sure. I can picture him now, with his tufty gray hair wafting about in time to his movement, and the large lump of fur resting upon his top lip, obscuring a rather large portion of his weathered old face, twisting and protruding as he formed his words enthusiastically. "There's no telling what you might run into out there, son," he would often exclaim in his gruff, yet somehow gentle voice. But anyway, I'm here to share my own story, and I hope I can portray it as well as Henry often did. I remember the rays of the low-set afternoon sun were still strong for that particular time of year, casting a warm glow over the still green forest surrounding us. We had just finished packing our kit bags with the markers and measuring equipment we would need, and were about to set off to the designated area on our charts to begin tagging trees ready for harvest. This was our last job for the day, and conversation was thin as Stan, the new guy, didn't seem like a conversationalist of any kind, and the three of us settled into that semi-comfortable silence that strangers often find themselves in when waiting for a bus or queuing up at the checkouts in the store. He struck me as the sort of person who was simply here to do his job and then go home. He had no interest in it other than the financial reward he would receive at the end of each week of work. Fine by me, I thought, as we quietly made our way along the well-worn path. The route we were taking was one often used by hikers to reach the nearby camping area and a rather nice viewing point. A few minutes passed before anyone broke the silence, and it was Henry that did so. "Looks like we need to follow the trail as far as the fork, then hang a turn south into the trees," he stated. "Then probably another 20 minutes heading slightly east, and we should spot the first few that are ready for the chop," I said. "You have been out this way before then, I take it?" Henry paused a beat before answering. "Yep. Remember this trail well, been a few years, mind you." And he gave me a quick glance over his shoulder. I noticed that when I had asked the question, he had straightened his back ever so slightly as he answered. "Something the matter, Henry?" I asked. "Not the location of one of your famous ghost stories, is it?" I said jokingly, trying to lighten the atmosphere. Stan gave me a funny look that clearly said he didn't know what I was on about. Henry just scratched at his thinning hair. "Ain't no ghosts in my stories, son. He didn't say anything more, just maintained the same pace, trudging ahead along the trail. What stories are you talking about? Stan was looking at me. A look of concern had crossed his face. He was only 20 or 21. His slight build looked out of place in his uniform, and the kit bag looked like it might pull him down to the ground at any moment. Oh, nothing really. Henry likes to tell stories about himself and scary stuff that's happened to him out here. He's quite the storyteller. Wouldn't you say, Henry? I said, glancing past Stan to where he was making his steady progress. He didn't respond. Scary stories? Ha, like what? Stan said. Not ghosts. Witches and werewolves. Ain't that right, Henry? I said, trying again to get a reaction out of him. But still, he remained silent, except this time I saw his shoulders rise and drop in a theatrical sigh. I continued. Rumor has it the poor dude ended up marrying one. I said jokingly, expecting to have to dodge a right hook from Henry, but still, there was no noticeable reaction. I bet there are some really weird things out here. Not like people spend much time out wandering about the forests, is it? Stan said, adding his thoughts on the matter. Finally he spoke. Not true, son. There's plenty of things out here. Not just deer and cougars, though. But sure, there are fewer people relying on the land nowadays compared to when I was your age, and that's for the best, I can assure you. So what about hikers and such? Should they worry about these things? Asked Stan. He's been out here all of an hour, and already he's lapping it all up. I thought. I wasn't that gullible when I was so young. Things is right, boy. I don't rightly know what someone should call them, Henry said. Sometimes I wonder if they're even really of this world. Okay, let's not scare the crap out of the poor guy before he's even done any work, Henry. We've got a lot to get on with this afternoon, and we need all the help we can get if we want a chance of getting home in time to see the sunset. I interjected. Henry chimed back with, all I'm saying is it's best to keep an eye out for weird crap out here. We're alone and a good few miles from, well, anybody if you think a bow. That's enough, man. I cut him short. For Pete's sake, can we just get on with finding these trees and doing our jobs? My temper was fraying. Henry wasn't normally like this. Usually he just wanted the same as me. Do a good job, then get on with making it back to the truck safely before it gets dark. I too had heard strange noises when working out alone, but your mind plays tricks on you when there's no company. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck out here in the pitch black with a rookie and Mr. Stephen King himself, lugging all this crap about with us. Henry just grunted something at me and carried on walking. Stan was eyeing me with a look of worry about him, but didn't press the matter any further, much to my relief. It wasn't much longer before we reached the fork in the trail that Henry had mentioned earlier. He set down his bag and took a seat on a fallen tree, whilst I took out the chart and made note of our destination from where we were. Looks like we cut through in this direction, I pointed out. Then it should be only another 20 minutes further on. Is it okay if I go take a leak? Asked Stan. I shouldn't have finished my flask of coffee on the drive over here. Does a bear crap in the woods? Replied Henry. Stan seemed a little embarrassed, but said no more, and cut off the path through the tree line for a little privacy. The trees were a lot denser in the direction we were headed. Not much sunlight made its way through the thick canopy provided by the trees and foliage. There was a slight chill in the air now, it seemed, and a gentle breeze had picked up along with what was the beginning of the even chorus of bird songs. So what do you make of him? I took the opportunity to ask Henry. Who? What do you mean who? Stanley, the new guy. You know, been with us the past couple hours on his first day. Or is your memory going in your old age? My memory is just fine, actually. I was just thinking about something else is all. Something else? Henry didn't reply. Care to elaborate? I asked after a moment. Just the last time I was up here. Not one of my best days at work, from what I remember. Some really weird stuff started happening. Oh God, can you drop the weird stuff thing already? I replied tensely. For the first time that afternoon, I felt a strange sense that something was not quite right. Like the sensation we were being observed or something. Geez, have you let him get to you too? I thought to myself. I shook the feeling off, and a moment or two later Stan returned, and we made our way east as planned. Though this time I was paying a lot more attention to our surroundings. The area we were in occasionally received reports of large carnivores such as mountain lions, gray wolves, and black bears. It sometimes paid to keep a casual idea of your surroundings. I didn't fancy unknowingly being stalked by a mountain lion or such. About halfway to the marked area on the map, I began feeling my legs start to protest at carrying the large weight on my back. I wasn't unfit by a long run. Far from it, in fact. But as we were no longer on the marked path, It was surprising how much more energy was required to make progress through the undergrowth. Where we were headed was only just over a half-mile from the trail as the crow flies, but the going was much tougher and more time-consuming. I began to wonder how long Henry would go before he too started to slow, but to my surprise he carried on without a problem. Stan, on the other hand, was clearly not as used to the hard trek with the extra weight. Dark sweat patches had formed around his armpits, and I noticed him occasionally wiping the sweat from his brow. Suddenly in the distance, somewhere came the sound of what I could only say was a chainsaw. Well, close to the sound of one anyway. It had an unusual buzz to it that undeniably sounded a lot closer than the noise of the chainsaw itself. All three of us stopped to listen. None of us seemed to be able to tell which way it was coming from. Didn't realize we were near a logging site out this way, I thought out loud. We're not. The closest one is about 40 miles from here, countered Henry. Could just be someone gathering some firewood, I said. Weirdly, the noises I normally associated with the forest had stopped. The breeze had died too. Sweat beaded on the back of my neck and slowly made a cold trail down right to where my belt was. I shivered slightly in response. I scanned our surroundings looking for the source of the noise, but the trees created a weird acoustic, and I found it impossible to tell. Strange, Henry said. It sounds wrong. What do you mean? I asked. It sounds like it's on a loop. Just the same buzzing noise on repeat. He was right. I hadn't noticed it at first, but it was clear now. There was no deviation in the tone of the chainsaw noise. Not like when you cut wood and the tone and pitch change as the engine works more and less to cut through the trunk of a tree. Something wasn't right about it, and it just made me want to be as far away as possible from it. Whatever it was giving me chills down my spine. Suddenly the sound stopped. Without warning, we were plunged into complete silence. No leaves rustling in the wind. That breeze was gone too, but most strange of all, not a single bird was singing. Not a single note. My unease grew even more to a point where I actually felt like there was a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow. We should just keep MO click. The sound came before I could finish my sentence. I glanced over to where the noise had come from, and I saw Henry aiming a .38 revolver high above his head. What the foo boom? He fired it. The surrounding area echoed the sound across the whole place, and the forest itself seemed to come alive as hundreds of birds flocked from the treetops and made a quick getaway from the loud noise. In the distance, I noticed a few deer dart from the cover and disappear into the thick vegetation of the forest. You crazy son of a gun. Why the hell do you have that out here? I asked angrily. You know we could lose our jobs if they find out you carry one of those in a company vehicle. Calm down, son. It's just a bit of protection. This is bear country. Don't forget, said Henry crossly. Besides, nobody will find out as long nobody says anything. He eyed Stan and me as he said this. Geez. All right, just put the thing away before you blow someone's head off waving that about. Can we just get on and get home already? I said, throwing my arms up into the air and pushing past them both in the direction of the trees to the east. The chainsaw noise had disappeared too. Whoever it was were now probably scared someone lunatic was out here with a gun in the middle of nowhere. Henry scowled at me as I passed him, but soon matched my pace and was walking along beside me. Stan was following on behind. He didn't seem the least bit worried about what just happened. Guy's an idiot, this one. How can he not give a damn about him randomly firing off shots when he's just met the man? I wondered. You can thank me later, Henry said to me under his breath. What for? Bringing a gun with you to work, so we can all get fired? No, for probably saving your tail back there, he said. From what? You really are crazy, aren't you? They have been following us for a while now. Goosebumps covered all over my skin, and I suddenly went cold. The hell are you on about, Henry? Don't mess about. This is not funny, man. Look, I'm not going to say anything, so just drop the act, will ya? I said. My mind went back to the chainsaw noise, wondering if he wasn't just trying to scare the living crap out of me, because if he was, it was damned well working. Them things, you might not have seen them, but I did. See, I know what I'm looking for. I've seen them before, the last time I was out these ways like I said earlier. What things, Henry? I thought those were just stories you made up to scare people. Holy hell, it was getting me worried enough as it is. I don't want to hear any more of it, I said. Look, all I know is that they mean bad trouble. They aren't natural, whatever they are. People go missing out here regularly, and nobody seems to give a damn about it. Whole groups of people have gone out hiking and never return. Campsites are found undisturbed, but the owner just outright disappears. Then, the next you hear about them is a random piece of their clothing turns up out of the blue, usually a shoe or something, no blood on it or scratches or anything, normally within a few days of them disappearing. But whatever turns up is usually far away from where they went missing. Too far for them to have got there themselves in the time that they are gone. We're talking miles away. Something strange happens in this forest, so keep your eyes peeled, son. It might just mean the difference between going home tonight and not. This was the most I'd ever heard Henry say when not recalling one of his many stories. Something about the way he was looking at me and the way he said it told me he was being serious. So why aren't telling Stan the same thing? If it's that dangerous here, I countered, because I don't trust him as far as I can breathe. Something different about him compared to before. He won't look me in the eye. Also, in case you haven't noticed, he hasn't said a damned word since we left the trail back there. He was right. Stan had not said a word since he left us and came back. He didn't even flinch when Henry had fired the gun a minute ago, and he was standing right next to him. It should have nearly deafened him. I thought about what he was telling me and tried to process it all. The sun was getting lower, and the light level in the forest suddenly seemed a lot darker. All right, let's just say you're right. We're in the crap and being followed by whatever it is, and something's not up with Stan. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure he couldn't hear us. Stan was ambling along behind us and staring hard straight back at me. You all right back there, Stan? I stumbled over the words, oozing suspicion. He just smiled back and carried on walking, then looked out to his right into the trees. Damn, what was up with his eyes? They looked as though they were glistening, as if he was going to cry. But his posture and his body language were nothing but confidence. Yet at the same time the way he was walking seemed off, slightly rigid or something. Henry drew my attention away as he started speaking again. If I'm right, which I'm almost certain I am, we need to make it back to the truck and out of these trees and fast. What if we don't make it back to the truck? I asked fearfully. Then we're screwed, said Henry point blank. By now I was genuinely scared. For the first time in my life, I was fearing for my life, and I didn't even know what I was scared of. We need to turn back. We're only an hour's hike from the truck, and we should have enough daylight left to make it in time. But we need to leave. Now, said Henry. And what about Stan? You think there's something wrong about him? I asked Henry. I think he's one of them, he said. Back when we're at the fork and he came back from having a leak, didn't you notice how quiet everything was? Like complete silence. Not quite, but damn silent. What, but it's Stan. Are you sure you don't need GLA? They can change into other things, came Henry's reply. My mind was racing, trying to take it all in. There was so much that didn't make sense. It should all just belong in a horror movie, but now apparently it was real. It takes them time to perfect it, and usually it's not perfect. They even sound exactly the same as the person they are copying. I'm pretty sure that chainsaw noise back there was one of them. That's why it was sounding like a loop. Almost as he finished speaking, the chainsaw noise started up again, as if on cue. This time, though, it was a lot closer, and I was certain I saw movement behind Henry. We both froze. Henry followed my gaze. What I saw chilled me to the core. In the middle distance was the silhouette of what sort of resembled a person sitting on their haunches, but this person would have easily been at least 8 feet tall if they were standing. It took a step closer, and must have covered a good 10 meters in one stride. Its skin caught a rare ray of sunlight filtering through the trees. Its skin was pale and sickly looking, and appeared to be painfully drawn tight over the skeletal frame of its body, almost to the point of splitting open. I felt my blood run cold, but I couldn't move. I was frozen to the spot with fear. The same seemed to apply to Henry beside me. It cocked its head at us both, like a dog sometimes does. I realized its lopsided mouth was open, and just as it closed it, the chainsaw noise stopped abruptly, only to start again when it opened its mouth for a second time. Inside were luminous serrated teeth, huge teeth, like some dramatic makeup prop. Henry stole a quick glance behind us. Damn, he whispered. Stan is gone. What the hell, I stammered, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from this thing. It was like it was staring straight into my very being. Suddenly it closed and opened its mouth again. This time, instead of the chainsaw, it emitted a loud and clear click. Henry looked down at the revolver in his waistband. Holy crap, it's mimicking the noises we've been making, he said. Almost instantly the creature lurched forward towards us at an incredible speed, but on all fours, bounding over a fallen tree half its own height like it was nothing. Run, I bellowed. I took off without looking back to check if Henry or the creature was following. I could hear branches breaking behind me, which I'm sure must have been him. As off to my side, I could hear the same, only a lot louder, as if whole trees were being snapped in half. I ran for my dear life, as fast as my legs would carry me. I dropped the heavy bag that was weighing me down, expensive gear crashing to the floor. Damn it, I don't care how much it's worth, I thought. The chainsaw noise was underway again, getting nearer and faster as I broke back onto the Salt Creek Trail. My feet pounded the dirt beneath me as I pleaded with my legs to move faster. I suddenly was hit by what I could only describe as a wall of stench. The smell of rotting flesh was unmistakable, making me retch bile into my own mouth and burning my throat at the same time. I looked off to my side, and to my horror the beast was getting closer, bounding through the trees just a few meters off. It locked eyes with me, and I nearly stumbled. The thing was smiling at me, showing off row after row of unimaginably jagged, sharp teeth. It opened its mouth and let off an animalistic screech that was high-pitched and shrill, but reverberated around inside my body at the same time. I could hear Henry behind me somehow keeping pace somehow. He was keeping up even though he was in his 60s, and we must have covered most of a mile by now. My own lungs were on fire, and I could feel the burning in my legs start to become too much to push through. I was running on pure adrenaline and fear. I rounded the last corner before the small clearing, where we had parked the truck earlier, just a bit further, and I was free of this nightmare. As I crested the small hill leading into the car park, my heart sank. There was no truck. There wasn't even a car park, just another seemingly endless trail. My mind worked overtime trying to figure out if I had made a wrong turn. I was sure I hadn't. There was only one trail anywhere near here, and it was the only one in and out of the forest for miles around. I could hear the creature gaining on me. I dared not look into the trees again to see how close it was. My thoughts changed instantly as I heard the unmistakable noise of someone stumbling behind me. Oh fuck. Crap. Ugh. Henry had fallen. I skidded to a halt and swung around to grab him. No. Keep going. He yelled at me. I hesitated for a split second. No, I can't leave him, I thought. But it was all the time the thing needed. Before I could take one step in Henry's direction, it was upon him. It pinned him face down into the dirt as it looked up at me. Its face was different. It looked like some kind of wolf, but with the torso of a man. What would have been its rear legs were also that of a wolf. Only this thing was standing up now, and was at least 7 or 8 feet tall. All I could smell was rotting flesh, so strong it was making me want to puke again. My mind tried to make sense of it all. Had it changed shape again? I asked myself. The creature opened its wide mouth and let off a horrific screech before leaping away with Henry and its clutches into the tree line. As I stood there dumbfounded, I heard a wet squelching and cracking sound accompanied by a terrible guttural scream. He was dead. Henry was dead. Before I could even process that he was gone, taken by some damned creature, I had the chainsaw off to my side again. Tree branches started thumping and cracking as something made its way to where I was, and fast. There must have been more than one, I realized. I took off again, not even time to think about what Savage and Henry must have met. Hell, I didn't even want to try to imagine it. As fast as my legs would carry me, I headed further along the trail that should have taken me back to the truck and to safety. Up ahead, there was a turn in the track. Could I have got it wrong? Was the car parked further than I had originally thought? All around me, the forest was alive with screeching and branches snapping and the loud clicks of Henry's revolver cocking. It was getting louder the closer I got to the bend up ahead. As I suddenly was on top of the corner, the noises reached fever pitch. I was sure I was done for. I rounded the bend only to be confronted with the sudden end of the trail and a wall of dense, thick trees. I was screwed. I was certain that these were going to be the last moments of my life, torn to shreds by something nobody even knew existed. I dove into the trees, not wanting to give up yet, somehow believing I could escape. But in reality, the trees were where they were most at home, leaping about like it was nothing while I blindly tripped and stumbled my way onwards. Without warning, the ground beneath my feet dropped away, and before I knew it, I was falling down and down, smashing into trees and branches on the way. I looked down at where I would land just in time to see a massive bough from a tree coming straight for my face. I hit it full force and saw stars replace my vision. I tried not to think of the terrible things about to happen to me after those things caught up with me. Then everything simply went black. All I was aware of was a high-pitched whining noise coming and going. I'm not sure how much time passed. The first thing I could sense was movement all around me. Then I could hear shouting. Yes, shouting. That meant people. Something opened my eye and a blinding bright light poured in, stinging my corneas. Then the same to the other. I opened them both and was staring face to face with a woman I had never seen before. He's awake. she exclaimed. My head was pounding, and there was a tingling sensation down my left side. Suddenly I was aware of a terrible throbbing in my forehead. I let out a pathetic groan in response to the pain. "Morphine," said the woman loudly. Her booming words rattled my brain. "It's okay, sir. We're going to give you something for the pain. Just try to relax and not move." She was holding my head firmly in place. My eyes scanned over behind her, and I saw a male paramedic coming over with a syringe. "He just fell out of the tree line straight in front of my rig," a large man said. He was wearing denim and a leather jacket. He looked to be speaking to a police officer who was busy taking notes. I must have blacked out again, because I next woke up in the hospital as a nurse was reading my vitals. "Hello, sir. Don't worry. You are safe now. That was some nasty accident you had back there. You were lucky that 18-wheeler didn't run you over." I opened my mouth, tried and speak, but no matter how hard I tried, no words would come out. It turned out I had suffered mild brain damage as a result of my fall. It took me nearly 3 years to be able to speak properly again. Endless therapy sessions, and the constant pain of not being able to tell anyone about what had really happened in that forest. Henry and Stan, to this day, are still listed as missing people. Police interviewed me, but all I could say was that I couldn't remember anything that happened that day. I was considered a suspect for a very long time, but they had no evidence of any foul play. I think eventually they got bored and genuinely started to believe I had hit my head hard enough to not remember any of it. I was also visited in the hospital by a representative of my employer. I was basically scared of signing a non-disclosure form about anything that might have happened to me whilst in the forest. I wish that were true. The truck driver visited me also during my time in the hospital. He was a nice man, if a bit rough around the edges. Nick Current is his name, and I'm still friends with him today, nearly 20 years later. The thing is, though, something he told me doesn't quite sit right. The location where I nearly landed directly under his wheels was just outside of Bloomington on the I-46 road, over 10 miles away from where we were working that day. I still don't know what those things were in the woods. I try not to think about it mostly. They just give me nightmares. I'm just glad to have gotten it off my chest, so to speak. Maybe tonight I will sleep a little better finally. I just hope nobody else has to go through the same things that I did almost 30 years ago. I've always felt more at home in the wild expanses of Montana than anywhere else. The crisp air, the scent of pine and earth, the clear, star-filled nights, they're a part of who I am. My name is Robert Blake, a park ranger. At least, that's what I used to be. The day that changed, everything started out just like any other. The sun painted a golden hue over the morning sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. But the call I received that day was anything but ordinary. Lisa, a young hiker with a taste for the path less traveled, had gone missing. With a sense of determination coursing through me, I prepared myself for the search. It wasn't the first time I had been tasked with finding a lost soul in the wild, and I intended to bring Lisa back, just like all the others before her. I packed my gear, checked my compass, and set out towards the unexplored region where Lisa was last seen, a remote, barely touched part of the park that folks around here tend to avoid. As my boots crunched through the carpet of pine needles, a chill gripped me, unnatural for the season. The forest stood tall and dense, its quietness oddly unsettling. Usually the forest echoed with life, birds singing, leaves rustling, the murmur of a distant creek. That day the silence was profound, an orchestra with no conductor. I shrugged it off as just another quirk of this lesser-known part of the forest. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest seemed to change around me. The trees looked distorted, gnarled, as if they held untold stories. Animals I encountered had a strange, almost knowing look in their eyes, their behaviors erring on the side of bizarre. They watched me as I passed, their gaze unsettling, filled with an eerie intelligence. As I progressed, my compass needle started to dance wildly. North was everywhere and nowhere. Static filled my radio, punctuated by fragments of an unintelligible language that sent chills down my spine. This was not normal, not at all, and the realization sank heavy in my stomach. But I couldn't turn back, not yet. There was a girl missing, and it was my job to find her. Hours turned into an afternoon when I stumbled upon what I'd been searching for, Lisa's campsite. The tent was torn apart, her belongings scattered around in disarray, but the absence of struggle or blood was eerily ominous. I found her diary, filled with hastily scribbled entries about whispering shadows and eyes in the darkness. As I read, a shudder ran through me. It was unsettling, yes, but also a sign that Lisa was here, and I had to find her. The sun began its descent, and darkness started to creep into the forest. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I decided to stay, to brave the darkness. Maybe I'd find something in the night that would lead me to Lisa. Looking back, I see now that it wasn't the wisest decision, but at that moment, all I knew was I couldn't leave Lisa alone in this eerie forest. So I stayed, oblivious to the terror that the night would bring. Little did I know, I was stepping into a nightmare that would forever change me, leaving scars that even time wouldn't heal. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness. I set up a makeshift camp near Lisa's torn tent, the stark signs of her disappearance a grim reminder of my task. As the last light faded, the chilling silence grew heavier, a tangible entity pressing on me from all sides. I had always loved the night. The darkness was a canvas for the stars, the silence a melody of the wilderness. But that night, under the canopies of the ominous trees, the darkness felt different. It felt alive, almost sentient. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a void, an emptiness that felt like it was consuming everything, even sound itself. The wildlife, which had unnerved me in the daylight, was now completely absent, their absence only amplifying the sense of dread. I found myself missing their odd behaviors, their strange watchfulness. At least they were a sign of life, a comfort in the increasingly foreign landscape. As hours rolled by, the anomalies I had noticed in the day worsened. My compass needle continued its frenzied dance, oblivious to the laws of nature. The radio's static was a steady undertone, broken only by those cryptic foreign whispers. They grew louder, more insistent as the night grew darker, a grotesque soundtrack to my mounting fear. I began reading Lisa's diary again, seeking some clue, some hint about what might have happened to her. Her frantic entries about the shadows that whispered and the eyes in the darkness took on a terrifying new meaning as I sat in the gloom. Was this what she had felt? The same inexplicable fear, the sense of being watched? Desperate to break the deafening silence, I found myself speaking out loud, calling for Lisa, hoping against hope that she would respond. But my voice sounded strange, distorted, swallowed by the eerie quiet. The forest seemed to be listening, waiting. The dread was a living creature now, curling around my heart in a grip of ice. In the midst of this, I found something peculiar near Lisa's tent, a trail of peculiar footprints leading into the deeper parts of the forest. They were not human, nor any animal I could recognize. A bizarre pattern that stirred a primal fear in me, a remnant from ancient times when humans were prey, not predators. I decided then, in a bout of what I now know was folly disguised as bravery, to follow the trail. I had a torch, a gun, a sense of duty that was beginning to feel more like a death wish. I couldn't shake off the feeling of eyes on me, a watchful presence that was neither animal nor human. With a deep breath, I ventured further into the heart of the woods. As I walked, my footprints joined those on the trail, an unwanted dance with an unseen partner. The decision to stay overnight was turning out to be far more terrifying than I had anticipated. The unsettling woods were proving to be more than just a strange, unexplored part of the forest. They were a living nightmare, a labyrinth of fear and dread. But I was in too deep to turn back now. The path before me held untold terror, but it was also the path to Lisa and to answers I desperately sought. That night, in the heart of the disturbed woods, I came face to face with an entity I could neither understand nor explain. I would not find Lisa, but I would find fear, a fear so profound that it would change me forever. Following the trail deeper into the forest, I could feel the world shifting around me. It wasn't just the disorientation of the dark or the spine-chilling silence that suffocated every sound. There was something else, something deeper, a presence that I couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of my being. I had started to feel at the moment I stepped into this eerie part of the forest, a sense of watchfulness that hung in the air like a specter. But now, as I trudged on, the presence became more palpable, pressing against my senses with a weight that was almost physical. It felt as if the forest itself was watching me, whispering in an ancient, forgotten language. Suddenly, my torch flickered out, and I was plunged into complete darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears, the rush of my own breath. The static from the radio had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. The whispers, now clearer, seemed to come from every direction, their cryptic syllables echoing through the darkness. In the distance, I saw something, a flicker of movement, a distortion in the darkness. I squinted, straining my eyes. Then I saw them, the eyes that Lisa had written about, glowing faintly in the dark, staring at me from the depths of the forest. I can't explain what I felt in that moment. It wasn't fear, not just fear. It was a feeling of being completely and utterly helpless, a small, insignificant creature in the face of something so ancient and vast that it made my existence feel pointless. I wanted to run, to flee, to escape this terrifying place, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by an unseen force. The eyes watched me unblinking. The whispers grew louder, their alien syllables filling the air around me. Then it moved. The eyes shifted, and I saw a form taking shape in the darkness, a mass of shadows that didn't belong to any animal, any human. The presence was no longer just a feeling. It was real, and it was right in front of me. The entity didn't attack. It didn't need to. Its mere presence was a show of power, of dominance. It was a part of the forest, or maybe the forest was a part of it. I could only stand there, frozen in fear, as it watched me with those glowing eyes. And then it spoke. The whispers converged into one voice, a deep, resonating tone that echoed through the silent forest. It spoke in the same cryptic language, the words sounding ancient and powerful. I didn't understand what it said, but I felt it. A warning, perhaps, or a proclamation. It was a message meant for me, a solitary human lost in the vast ancient wilderness. As abruptly as it had appeared, the entity receded into the darkness, the eyes fading away, the whispers dying out. But its presence remained, a lurking consciousness that filled the forest. I was left standing in the darkness, my mind reeling from the encounter. I didn't find Lisa that night, but I found something far more terrifying, an entity that was the forest, an ancient consciousness that still haunts me to this day. After the entity disappeared into the shadows, I was left alone in the profound darkness, my mind racing. The glowing eyes, the cryptic whispers, the sheer force of its presence, everything was imprinted on my mind, refusing to fade away. The forest, which had once felt like home, was now an alien world, a maze of terror where I was the prey. The silence was broken by a rustling sound. I spun around, the beam of my torch cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. The whispers had died down, but a new sound filled the air, a low hum, vibrating through the very ground beneath me. Then it came, a gust of wind, so cold that it seemed to seep into my bones. It whipped through the trees, stirring the leaves into a frenzied dance. A sense of dread filled me, a raw, primal fear that set my heart pounding. I could feel it again, the entity, its presence more intense than before. I started running. The fear, the raw terror, it fueled me, propelled me forward. Branches whipped against my face, roots seemed to rise to trip me up, but I didn't stop. I ran, my breath coming out in ragged gasps, the cold air stinging my lungs. Behind me I could hear it, the entity. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was the whispers, the hum, the wind, everything merging into a dreadful symphony that seemed to follow me. I could feel its eyes on me, a predator watching its prey. I didn't know where I was going. My compass was useless, spinning wildly. My torch was a feeble defense against the all-encompassing darkness. All I knew was that I had to get away, get out of this terrifying place. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a glimmer of light in the distance. The sun was rising, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. I ran towards it, my entire being focused on escaping the darkness, escaping the entity. As I emerged from the forest, the sun's rays hit me, warm and reassuring. I collapsed onto the grass, my lungs heaving, my body screaming from the exertion. Behind me the forest stood silent, a stark silhouette against the dawn sky. The entity didn't follow me out of the forest. Maybe it couldn't, or maybe it chose not to, but even as I lay there watching the sun rise, I could still feel it. Its presence was like a shadow, a dark imprint on my consciousness. I never went back into the forest after that. The memory of that night, the terror, the entity, it was too much. I still have nightmares, dreams where I am back in the forest, being chased by the entity, its glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The forest was my home, my sanctuary, but that night it turned into a terrifying labyrinth, a place of fear and nightmares. It was a reminder that there are things in this world that we cannot understand, cannot explain, entities that are as old as the forest itself, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. The morning after the encounter with the entity, I was a changed man. I had ventured into the forest as a park ranger, confident and fearless, only to emerge as a shell of my former self, broken and terrified. As the sun rose higher, painting the world in shades of light, I hobbled back to the ranger station. Every step away from the forest felt like a victory, a triumph over the unspeakable terror that lurked within its depths. I entered the ranger station, my body still shaking from the adrenaline, my mind in turmoil. The familiar space felt foreign, alien, just like everything else since my encounter. I sat at my desk. The report forms in front of me, a grim reminder of the task I had failed. I had gone into the forest to find Lisa, to bring her back to safety. Instead, I came back alone, with nothing but a terrifying story and the haunting memory of an entity that defied all logic and reason. How could I write that in a report? How could I explain the unexplainable? I wrote the only thing I could. I reported that I had found signs of a struggle near Lisa's campsite, signs of an animal attack. I couldn't bring myself to write about the entity, the glowing eyes, the cryptic whispers. Who would believe me? I hardly believed it myself. As the days turned into weeks, my life became a monotonous routine. I went through the motions, did my duties, filed my reports, but I could never go back into the forest. Each time I tried, I could feel it calling to me, the entity, its presence like a specter hanging over the forest. Sleep became an elusive friend. Each time I closed my eyes, I was back in the forest, under the gaze of those glowing eyes, surrounded by the alien whispers. I woke up each night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the echoes of the entity's voice still ringing in my ears. I knew then that I could no longer continue as a park ranger. The forest, once my sanctuary, was now a symbol of my deepest fears. The thought of stepping into its depths, of feeling the entity's gaze on me, it was too much to bear. So I quit my job, I left the park, the forest, and moved as far away as I could. I traded the vast wilderness for the bustling city, the ominous silence for the constant noise, the ancient trees for towering buildings. It was a painful decision, a tearing away from a part of my soul, but it was a necessary one. I often wonder about Lisa, about what she saw, what she felt. Did she encounter the entity? Was she as terrified as I was? I wish I could have done more, could have saved her. But in the face of the inexplicable terror, my courage had failed me. The memory of the entity, its glowing eyes, its powerful presence, it haunts me to this day. I am a prisoner of my own fear, trapped in a nightmare that refuses to end. The forest, the entity, it is a part of me now, a chilling reminder of the night that changed my life forever. Moving to the city didn't help as much as I'd hoped. The towering buildings, the constant noise, the ceaseless bustle, they were all alien to me. I felt like a man out of time, lost in a world that was too loud, too fast, too different. But it was still better than the forest, better than the haunting gaze of the entity. My nights remained plagued with nightmares. The entity was always there, its glowing eyes watching me, its cryptic whispers echoing in my ears. I'd wake up gasping for breath, the terror of the encounter still raw, still fresh. It's been years since that fateful night, since I left the park and moved to the city. I've grown used to the concrete jungle, the human-made wilderness, but I've never gotten over the fear, the dread that lurks in the back of my mind. One day, while strolling through a city park, I saw a group of children playing near a small grove of trees. The sight of the trees, their leaves rustling in the wind, sent a shiver down my spine. I could almost feel the entity's presence, the familiar sense of watchfulness. I quickly left the park, my heart pounding, my palms sweaty. Even the smallest grove was enough to trigger my fear, to send me spiraling back into the terror of that night. I realized then that I would never escape the entity, not truly. There are nights when I lie awake, the city's noise a muted backdrop to my thoughts. I think about the forest, the entity, the mysteries that lurk within the wilderness. I wonder if it's still there, still watching, still waiting. I know that I can never go back, never face the entity again. The forest was my home, my sanctuary, but it's also my greatest fear, a haunting reminder of the terror that lies beneath the serene facade of nature. I sometimes receive letters from my former colleagues, updates about the park, about the forest. They found more missing hikers, more signs of struggle, more unsolved mysteries. Each letter is a chilling reminder of my encounter, of the terror that I left behind. The last letter contained a photograph. It was an image of the forest, taken near the place where I had encountered the entity. There, in the depths of the wilderness, caught in the camera's flash, were two glowing eyes watching, waiting. The image sent a jolt of fear through me, the memory of the encounter flooding back with an intensity that took my breath away. I could almost hear the whispers, feel the entity's gaze on me. It was a chilling reminder that the entity was still there, still watching. I know now that I can never escape the entity, never escape the forest. Even here, in the heart of the city, I can feel it. Its presence is a constant specter, a chilling shadow that haunts my every moment. I am forever marked by the entity, forever haunted by the terror of the forest. As I look out at the city skyline, the forest's memory looms in my mind, a reminder of the terror that lurks in the wilderness, the ancient entity that watches and waits. My sanctuary, my home, is now my forever nightmare. Never did I imagine that the forest I considered a second home could become my own personal nightmare. The day started like any other adventure into the Appalachian Mountains. The sun was shining, the sky an expanse of brilliant blue, and the leaves rustled like a hushed lullaby on the summer breeze. Duke, my trusty German shepherd, was beside me, his tongue lolling out in anticipation of our venture into the wild. As an off-duty park ranger, I loved these trips. They gave me a chance to forget the demanding nature of my job and reconnect with the serenity of the wilderness. I'd camped in these mountains countless times before, but this time it was different. It was just Duke and me, two adventurers eager for some solitude in the embrace of nature. I made the drive up to our usual spot, the tires of my trusty truck crunching over the gravel road. Unloading our gear, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. I took a moment, drinking in the vibrant greenery around me, the scent of pine and earth, the distant burble of a creek. I've always found something therapeutic about being out here, away from the bustle of everyday life. Duke, as always, was a bundle of energy. He dashed around, sniffing excitedly at bushes and trees marking our arrival. The sight of him, so happy and carefree, brought a smile to my face. "Slow down, boy," I called out to him, but my admonishment was swallowed by the expanse, my voice echoing softly against the distant mountains. Setting up camp was second nature to me. With practiced ease, I pitched our tent on a patch of flat ground near a clear, bubbling stream. I arranged the rest of our gear, double-checking everything was in order before rewarding myself with a break. I cracked open a beer, took a long swig, and watched as Duke splashed about in the stream. Night fell gradually, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of pink and orange before surrendering to the encroaching darkness. I built a campfire, its warm glow pushing back against the night. Duke settled in next to me, his wet coat steaming slightly in the fire's warmth. The comforting crackle of the fire filled the silence, a melody as familiar as an old song. As I looked out into the darkening forest, its shadows deepening with the waning light, I felt a strange unease. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the solitude and the encroaching night. Little did I know then that this journey would take a turn for the terrifying, that these familiar woods would soon become a maze of fear. I remember those last moments of peace, the calm before the storm, before I drifted off to sleep. Duke, my loyal companion, lay close, his rhythmic breathing a comforting lullaby. The forest whispered its nighttime secrets, the stars above twinkling like 1,000 watchful eyes. Yet, in that peaceful silence, a hint of our upcoming ordeal echoed ominously. If I'd known what awaited us, would I have packed up and left that very night? But, of course, the future was a mystery then, obscured by the veil of the unknown. Unaware of the nightmares that awaited us, Duke and I fell asleep to the symphony of the wild, blissfully ignorant of the horrors the following days held. Morning broke with a strange stillness, the usual chorus of birdsong muted, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. The first pangs of unease fluttered in my gut, but I shook it off, blaming it on a rough night's sleep. I went about my morning routine, brewing strong coffee over the campfire and sharing breakfast with Duke, who seemed his usual energetic self. Yet, as the day unfolded, an odd disquiet seeped into my bones. Time felt distorted, elastic. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. One moment, the sun was high in the sky, casting long, dappled shadows through the canopy, and the next, the afternoon was already waning, a cool breeze rustling through the trees. I tried to ignore the unsettling sensation, attributing it to my solo sojourn and the strange rhythm of the wilderness. But as the day wore on, the feeling persisted. An hour-long hike felt like minutes, while moments of idle rest stretched out, seemingly endless. As the disconcerting day gave way to twilight, I found another enigma waiting. My meticulously organized camping gear was displaced, items moved or missing entirely. My map and compass, which I'd placed inside my backpack, were found outside, near the edge of our camp. A pot I'd used to heat our dinner was missing, only to be discovered later, filled with rainwater, some distance away from our site. Duke, who usually dozed through the afternoons, was unusually alert, his ears perked up, his gaze constantly flitting towards the dense undergrowth. The sight of him, usually so carefree, now riddled with anxiety, unsettled me more than I cared to admit. The nightfall was eerie, the forest unnaturally silent. I cooked a simple meal, my thoughts racing, my heart beating an anxious rhythm in my chest. I considered leaving, but the thought of navigating the treacherous mountain roads at night kept me rooted. Later, as I lay under the canvas of the tent, the darkness pressing in from all sides, an unfamiliar sound echoed in the distance. A low hum, pulsating, seeming to originate from the depths of the forest. It was a sound alien to the usual symphony of the wilderness, chilling me to my core. Duke stiffened beside me, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I told myself that it was just the wind, the rustling of leaves, anything but the haunting drone that seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath us. My own reassurances fell flat, the sound continuing unabated, a spectral echo in the quiet night. As the surreal day gave way to an even stranger night, the reality of my situation began to set in. I was alone, lost in an unfamiliar version of my beloved wilderness, with only my faithful dog for company. As the strange sound filled the night, its rhythm matching the pounding fear in my heart, I realized that the solitude I had sought was morphing into a terrifying isolation. I spent the rest of the night in a fitful sleep, the haunting hum a constant undertone to my troubled dreams. The image of my displaced gear and Duke's anxious demeanor haunted me, the forest's whispers growing louder, more insidious. Unbeknownst to me then, this was just the beginning, the first strains of a nightmare that would plunge me and Duke into a horrifying ordeal, forever changing our perception of the wilderness we once considered home. Each day brought more confusion, my perception of time growing increasingly distorted. The pulsating hum from the heart of the forest became a nightly terror, an unyielding rhythm that reverberated in my bones, filling my dreams with a sense of impending doom. Even Duke, brave and stalwart as always, had become a shadow of his former self. His eyes, once filled with playful curiosity, were now clouded with a palpable fear. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my mind, a figment of my imagination, a consequence of solitude. After all, I was a seasoned park ranger, a man of the wilderness. I was familiar with every nook and cranny of these mountains, every animal that prowled these woods. But the displaced gear, the unsettling hum, the warping time, Duke's strange behavior, none of it fit the pattern of my past experiences. No natural explanation seemed to quell the terror brewing inside me. I was in my territory, yet it felt alien, as if the wilderness itself was turning against me. One morning, I awoke to find Duke rigid with fear, his fur standing on end, his eyes trained on the dense forest. I strained my ears, expecting to hear the eerie hum. But instead, a shuffling noise came from the undergrowth, too heavy to be just the wind rustling the leaves. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam piercing the early morning fog. But there was nothing there, just the dense forest, shrouded in a deceptive calm. The hum returned that night, more ominous than ever, as if mocking my attempts at reasoning. During the following days, I tried to carry on as normal, but the strange occurrences continued. Items were displaced more frequently, Duke's agitation escalated, and the ominous hum became a haunting serenade to the nightmare that was unfolding around me. As a park ranger, I had my share of frightening encounters, poachers, wildlife, harsh weather. But this was different. This fear was not of a known danger, but an unseen, unheard, unfathomable presence that seemed to cloak the forest. This fear gnawed at my sanity, kept me up at night, and made me dread the approaching darkness. Every night was a battle, a struggle to make sense of the unknown terror that gripped me. The once comforting isolation had turned into an oppressive solitude. Duke and I were on edge, our nerves frayed, the tension a heavy shroud wrapped around our little campsite, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The terrifying ordeal that was about to unfold was beyond anything I had ever faced in my life. It was a nightmare from which there was no waking, a horror that no amount of training could have prepared me for. As I stoked the dying embers of our campfire one night, another worldly presence descended upon our camp, an unspeakable terror that would confirm my worst fears and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. Little did I know that the pulsating hum that filled our nights, Duke's growing restlessness, and the strange happenings were merely the overture to an encounter that would send us fleeing into the depths of the forest, our very lives hanging in the balance. The night was black as pitch, the fire our only source of light against the enveloping darkness. The humming had grown louder, more insistent, a haunting dirge echoing through the desolate forest. Duke lay by my side, his body tense, every fiber of his being attuned to the unseen menace. The fear was a living, breathing entity now, wrapping its cold tendrils around my heart, squeezing tighter with every beat. I found myself staring into the shadows, my mind churning with horrifying possibilities. My rational side fought to regain control, yet the mounting evidence was hard to ignore. Suddenly, Duke growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. His gaze was fixed on a spot just beyond our firelit sanctuary. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding a brutal rhythm in my chest. There, on the edge of the light, something moved, an indistinct shape that was too large to be any regular forest inhabitant. I scrambled for my flashlight, its feeble beam cutting through the darkness, but the light only served to deepen the shadows, the creature lurking just beyond its reach. I could hear it moving, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs under its weight. As if it sensed my fear, the creature stepped into the light, its form clearer than I would have liked. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a twisted fusion of man and beast, its eyes glowing an eerie green. The sight of it, this perversion of nature, drained the blood from my face, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. A scream tore from my throat, raw and primal, a feeble protest against the unimaginable horror before me. Duke barked furiously, his usual courage wavering in the face of the monstrosity. The creature responded with a gut-wrenching roar, the sound echoing in the silent night, drowning out the omnipresent hum. Panic took over, obliterating any semblance of reason. I scooped up Duke and bolted, the flashlight dropping from my grasp, plunging our world into darkness. The terrifying roar followed us, a grotesque serenade to our desperate flight. The forest, once my haven, turned into a nightmarish labyrinth. Branches reached out like gnarled hands, clawing at my face and clothes. Rocks and roots emerged out of nowhere, tripping me up, but I couldn't afford to slow down, not with the monstrous presence hot on our heels. The fire, our camp, our gear, all were left behind in the chaos. My only thoughts were of escape, of getting as far away from the creature as possible. The forest closed in around me, an impenetrable wall of shadows and fear. Driven by sheer terror, Duke and I ran. We plunged deeper into the forest, our world reduced to the chilling roars of the creature and the thudding of our own hearts. As we ventured further into the unknown, I couldn't help but realize that we were not just running from a creature. We were running from the realization that our beloved wilderness had been transformed into a terrifying realm of the unknown, a place where nightmares came to life. Days and nights blurred into a relentless cycle of fear and exhaustion. The wilderness was no longer a familiar sanctuary. It was a twisted maze of haunting echoes and lurking shadows. Each rustle in the undergrowth was the creature closing in. Every unexpected sound was a signal of our impending doom. The creature, thankfully, seemed to have lost our trail, but the damage was done. The pulsating hum was replaced by a chilling silence that was just as unnerving. The disorientation was severe. I tried to navigate by the stars, my ranger training kicking in, but the dense canopy above offered little assistance. Duke and I moved as stealthily as possible, driven by an instinctive will to survive. Our days were spent in a haze of fear, our nights filled with disturbing dreams and jolts of panic. Our only sustenance was the few edible berries and plants I could identify, and the occasional small game I managed to snare. Eventually, after what felt like weeks but could have been days, we emerged on the other side of the forest. The sight of an open road slicing through the greenery was more beautiful than any mountain vista I had ever encountered. Relief washed over me, a palpable force that left me weak-kneed. Duke seemed to share my sentiment, his tail wagging for the first time in days. We staggered onto the road, our bodies battered, our spirits barely holding on. I tried to wave down the first vehicle I saw, but the driver, probably spooked by my disheveled appearance, sped away. My heart sank, but I gathered what little energy I had left and prepared to try again. The next car, however, was a different story. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, pulled over and rolled down his window. After explaining our predicament in a hoarse whisper, he readily agreed to take us back to my vehicle. The drive back was a surreal experience. Sitting in the passenger seat, with Duke's head resting on my lap, I watched the familiar landscapes whiz by, a stark contrast to the alien nightmare we had just escaped from. When we reached my parked vehicle, I thanked the driver profusely, promising to pay his kindness forward. As Duke and I climbed into the car, the man gave us a sympathetic smile and drove away. As I turned the key in the ignition, I took a moment to process everything we had gone through. The safety of the car felt like a cocoon, shielding us from the horror we had left behind. I stared at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature emerge from the forest. But there was nothing, just the whispering trees swaying in the breeze. We drove away in silence, the echoing roar of the creature still ringing in my ears, a chilling reminder of the nightmare we had survived. The hum may have subsided, The displaced gear was now a distant memory, but the terrifying creature and its haunting presence were forever seared into my consciousness. Little did I know that the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. The most chilling revelation was yet to come. I returned to my cabin at the edge of the park, a safe haven I never thought I'd see again. Duke and I were silent wrecks, our minds grappling with the terrifying ordeal we had barely survived. The comfort of a hot shower and a soft bed seemed a world away from the nightmare we had fled. After ensuring Duke was settled in, I ventured out to report my encounter to the local authorities. The disbelief was palpable as I recounted my experience, the creature, the hum, the displaced gear. I had expected skepticism, but the outright dismissal stung. Days turned into weeks, but the memories of the creature and the forest were as fresh as ever. Duke and I were forever altered by the experience, our once adventurous spirits replaced by a lingering dread, but the most terrifying part was yet to come. One night, as I lay tossing and turning, a familiar sound pierced the silence, the hum. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably the same ominous sound that had haunted our camping expedition. A cold fear gripped my heart. Duke's low growl confirmed my worst fears. I shot up in bed, my eyes scanning the darkness outside the window, but there was nothing, just the quiet, isolated landscape bathed in moonlight. But the hum persisted, a spectral symphony to my spiraling terror. That's when I noticed it. The flashlight, the same one I had dropped in our panicked flight, was lying on my bedside table. Its presence was impossible, a chilling testament to the inescapable horror that had followed us back. The forest, the creature, the terrifying ordeal. It was all right here in my supposed safe haven. The familiar objects in the cabin suddenly felt alien, menacing. I glanced at Duke, his eyes mirroring my fear. We were not safe. We had not escaped. The nightmare was not confined to the wilderness. It had followed us back, marking our existence with its horrifying presence. That night, sleep eluded me. The hum seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, an ominous lullaby for the dawn that never seemed to come. The cabin, once my refuge, was now just another scene in the terrifying narrative that was my life. The subsequent days were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia-filled days. The hum persisted, a constant reminder of the creature lurking in the shadows of my mind. The flashlight, despite my several attempts to dispose of it, always found its way back. As I pen down these words, the hum resonates around me, a soundtrack to my living nightmare. The flashlight flickers, casting eerie shadows around the room. Duke, my loyal companion, cowers by my side, his eyes never leaving the window. The wilderness has followed us back. The creature, the terror, the fear, they are all here, shrouded in the seemingly mundane surroundings of my home. There is no escape from this nightmare, no waking up to a bright and sunny day. Our tale doesn't end with a triumphant return. It continues in this never-ending horror that is our reality. This is our life now, forever trapped in a terrifying echo of that fateful camping trip in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. I sat in my cramped city apartment, the honking horns and constant hum of the city streets below me, providing the only soundtrack to my solitary existence. I was exhausted, tired of the gray buildings, the bustle, and the monotony that my life had become. I craved solitude, the call of the wild, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the song of a distant bird. The Appalachian Mountains, with their untouched beauty and serene silence, beckoned me. I spent my final night planning, laying out my hiking gear methodically on the floor. The crisp map spread out before me, the trails and routes crisscrossing like a complex web. The thought of stepping off the beaten path, away from my well-trodden routines, thrilled me. I felt a sense of freedom, of escape. It was the calm before a journey that I believed would be my salvation. The next morning, the dawn's first rays painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, heralding the start of my adventure. With my backpack packed to the brim with essentials, I locked my apartment for the last time in days and headed to my old, reliable truck. As I sat behind the wheel, I felt a sense of calm washing over me. It was as if I was leaving behind a version of myself, worn down by the grind of city life. The open road welcomed me like an old friend. The drive was a joy, watching the concrete jungle recede in my rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills, open fields, and finally, the towering majesty of the Appalachian Mountains. The sight of the rugged peaks rising high against the clear blue sky sparked a sense of adventure within me. It was like seeing an old friend after a long time. The familiarity mingled with a sense of anticipation. Finally, at the foot of the mountains, I parked my truck at the designated trailhead. Looking up at the forested slopes, I was taken aback by the sheer scale and the imposing beauty that lay before me. There was an unspoken promise in the wind that rustled through the ancient trees, an adventure waiting to unfold. A chill of excitement tingled up my spine as I hoisted my backpack and took my first step on the dirt path leading into the heart of the wilderness. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I left the signs of civilization behind. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the calls of unseen birds hidden in the green canopy above. The serenity was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I found myself whispering a silent prayer of thanks for this solitary communion with nature. The first day of hiking was blissful, my senses filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of the forest. As the sun started to set, painting the sky with warm hues, I set up my first camp. As I gazed up at the stars peeking through the forest canopy, I felt a sense of peace envelop me. The worries and frustrations of my city life seemed a world away. Little did I know then that the peace I reveled in was merely the calm before the storm. As I drifted off to sleep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, I was oblivious to the terrors that lay ahead, hidden in the depths of the forest. Little did I know that my longing for solitude would soon turn into a nightmare, making me question my sanity, my courage, and my will to survive. The morning broke with the birds' chorus, their melodious songs marking the start of a new day. The air was thick with the dewy freshness that only a forest morning can bring. I unzipped my tent and was met with a breathtaking sight, the morning sun filtering through the trees, casting long shadows and dancing lights on the forest floor. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the pure, untouched air, a luxury in my urban existence. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and a few swigs of water, I packed up my camp. With my backpack snug against my shoulders, I resumed my journey deeper into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. The trails were challenging but invigorating, and with every step, I felt a growing sense of freedom. There was something therapeutic about treading a path where few have walked, the solitude feeding my spirit. I relished in the calmness and the surreal beauty around me. My ears tuned into the forest soundtrack, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the sound of my own heartbeat in the overwhelming quiet. The whispers of the forest spoke volumes, drowning the noise of my past life. Lunch was a simple affair, a sandwich I'd prepared before setting off, now squashed but still appetizing. I found a spot near a small stream, the babbling water providing a calming backdrop. As I ate, I watched a family of deer cautiously approach the stream, their alert eyes scanning the surroundings before they lowered their heads to drink. The sight was humbling, reminding me of the simple raw beauty of life in the wild. As the day wore on, I found myself falling into a rhythm with the forest. I felt like a small piece of a giant puzzle, my presence insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The realization, instead of daunting me, comforted me. It was the escape from ego and self-importance that I'd been yearning for. I pressed on until the evening, when the setting sun set the sky ablaze with colors. I found a perfect spot to set up my night's camp, a small clearing by a giant oak tree. As I set up my tent, a sense of accomplishment washed over me. I'd survived my first full day in the wild, alone but not lonely. Once the camp was ready, I built a small fire, its warmth warding off the evening chill. As darkness descended, the forest transformed. The once familiar trees became silhouettes, their shadows stretching and warping in the firelight. The sounds too changed, the day's melodies replaced with the hoots, howls, and rustles of the forest's nocturnal life. Despite the change, I felt at peace. The wilderness was a balm to my tired soul. As I climbed into my tent, the last rays of the dying fire flickering, I reflected on my journey, the solitude, the beauty of the forest, the thrill of the unknown. It was everything I'd imagined. The city and its worries felt like a distant memory, and I fell asleep with a smile on my face. I had no inkling that the calm I was basking in was but a facade, that the real face of the forest was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I surrendered to sleep, I was oblivious to the fact that my life was about to take a turn into the realm of the unimaginable. The sun was high in the sky when I awoke on my second day in the Appalachian wilderness. I began my day with a quick breakfast, the soothing sounds of the forest lulling me into a false sense of peace and tranquility. As I repacked my gear and doused the remnants of the campfire, I looked forward to another day of solitary exploration in the wilderness. I had barely been on the trail for an hour when I stumbled upon an unexpected sight, a campsite. But it was not a current one. It was old, deserted, a haunting ghost of human presence in the otherwise untouched wilderness. A tattered tent, its once vibrant color faded by the sun and the elements, stood at the center, flanked by the remnants of a fire pit. I approached the site cautiously, a sense of unease crawling up my spine. There was something about the abandoned campsite that filled me with a sense of dread, a stark contrast to the serenity I had experienced since my arrival. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone, but all I found was silence. The campsite had been deserted for quite some time, that much was evident. But who had been here, and why they left in such a rush, was a mystery that hung heavy in the air. With a knot in my stomach, I decided to move on, leaving behind the eerie remnants of someone else's wilderness adventure. But as I delved deeper into the forest, another strange occurrence halted me in my tracks. I came across a tree marked with odd symbols, carved deep into its bark. They were unlike any trail markers or signs I'd ever seen before. There was a primitive tribal quality about them that sent a shiver down my spine. My mind started weaving stories, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were these symbols left by the same people who abandoned the campsite? Was I trespassing into some forbidden territory, marked by these strange signs? I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched, that I was not alone in these woods. Despite my apprehensions, I pressed on, the eerie silence of the forest only intensifying my fears. The cheerful songs of the birds and the rustling of the leaves in the breeze that once sounded harmonious now took on a haunting quality. The whispering wind carried with it a warning, a suggestion to turn back. But my curiosity outweighed my fears, and I decided to delve deeper into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. The abandoned campsite and the strange symbols were just isolated incidents, probably harmless. I had come to escape my urban life, to find solitude in the heart of the wilderness, and I was not about to let these unsettling discoveries deter me from my goal. Little did I know, as I walked further into the forest, that these were not just isolated incidents, but signs of the horrifying ordeal that lay ahead. I was oblivious to the fact that the eerie silence, the strange symbols, and the abandoned campsite were just the tip of the iceberg. The Appalachian wilderness had many more secrets, each more terrifying than the last, waiting to be discovered. As day turned to dusk, an orange hue painted the forest. My legs ached from the long day of hiking, and I felt a chill creeping into the air. I began to search for a spot to camp for the night, hoping to find a quiet place to rest. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, a glow caught my eye in the distance. The light flickered, dancing through the forest trees. Curiosity piqued. I quietly approached the source, veering off the marked path for the first time since my journey began. As I got closer, the soft hum of voices reached my ears. It was a strange melodic chanting, echoing through the woods. The glow I had noticed turned out to be a large bonfire, its flames reaching up to the darkening sky. Around it, shadowy figures swayed, their silhouettes warped and elongated in the firelight. I ducked behind a large tree, careful not to make a sound, and watched the bizarre scene unfold before me. The figures wore dark cloaks, their faces hidden in the shadows. They moved in unison, their chanting growing louder and more intense, their bodies swaying in a rhythmic dance. The spectacle was both fascinating and terrifying, a scene straight out of a horror movie. In the center of the circle, a large wooden figure loomed ominously. The flames from the fire licked its base, casting a terrifying glow on its face. The carving was grotesque, an embodiment of evil. The sight sent a shudder down my spine. The rituals of the robed figures intensified, their chants rising to a fever pitch. The whole scene was surreal, a shocking contrast to the calm of the Appalachian wilderness I had enjoyed so far. I was petrified, unable to tear my gaze away from the chilling spectacle. Suddenly, everything went still. The chanting stopped, replaced by a silence that was deafening in its intensity. Then a robed figure stepped forward, raising a staff above his head. His voice echoed through the clearing, a harsh command that made the very air vibrate with its intensity. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned, his gaze scanning the surrounding woods. His eyes, glowing in the firelight, seemed to bore right into me. I held my breath, praying he hadn't seen me. But it was too late. With a swift motion, the figure pointed directly at my hiding place. A collective gasp echoed through the clearing, followed by silence. Then, all hell broke loose. The cultists erupted into motion, several breaking away from the circle and dashing towards me. I could see their faces now, illuminated by the firelight, twisted in anger and determination. The terror that surged through me was primal. I turned and ran, the cult's shouts echoing behind me. The tranquil wilderness had turned into a nightmare, and as I sprinted into the dense forest, I knew my solitary retreat had turned into a terrifying game of survival. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum as I ran blindly through the dark forest. The comforting sounds of the wilderness had been replaced with the haunting echoes of the cultists' shouts and the harsh crunch of foliage under their feet. The peaceful paradise I had sought was now a terrifying labyrinth, a backdrop to the nightmarish chase. I stumbled, tripped and tumbled, my hands flailing in the darkness to grasp at anything that could help me stay upright. My lungs burned for air, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But fear was a powerful motivator, and I pushed myself harder. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. The cultists were getting closer. I could hear their ragged breaths, the rustling of their cloaks, their ominous murmurs. The thought of being caught sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through my veins, spurring me to run faster. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I was thrown forward, tumbling into a dense undergrowth. Pain shot through my ankle, and I gritted my teeth to stifle a scream. I had to keep moving, keep running. Dragging myself up, I forced myself to limp onwards. Each step was a challenge, but the echoes of my pursuers were my motivation. The forest had turned into a threatening entity, its once familiar trees now grotesque silhouettes against the starlit sky, its trails twisted and disorienting. But then I saw it, the silhouette of a large tree, its branches reaching out towards the sky. An idea took root in my mind. Without a second thought, I dashed towards it, dragging my injured foot. With the last ounce of my strength, I started to climb. The rough bark scraped my hands, the branches digging into my flesh, but the pain was insignificant compared to the fear of being caught. I hauled myself higher and higher till I was nestled amongst the thick branches. Exhausted, I lay there, hidden from view, my breath ragged and my body aching. I waited, holding my breath as the sounds of my pursuers grew closer. Then they were there, their shadowy forms illuminated by the pale moonlight. They stopped, their breaths heavy, their heads swiveling as they searched the surroundings. After what seemed like an eternity, they moved on, their footsteps growing fainter until they were swallowed by the silence of the night. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I was lost, injured, and being hunted in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness. The stars twinkled above me, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding beneath them. I clung to the tree, my sanctuary in the face of terror, my mind racing. I had sought solitude in these woods, but what I had found was a terrifying reality I was ill-equipped to face. The grim truth settled in. I was in a fight for survival. My peaceful retreat turned into a game of cat and mouse. The serenity of the Appalachian wilderness was a far cry from the terror that now gripped me. As I looked out into the darkness, I realized that I had stepped into a realm of the unknown, a world that I never imagined could exist within the heart of this wilderness. Pinned high in my treetop perch, the chill of the night seeped into my bones. My heart still pounded in my chest from the adrenaline rush, the echoes of the pursuit still ringing in my ears. The branches around me swayed gently, lulling me into a trance. Below me the dark forest stretched out, a haunting canvas of shadows and mystery. I tried to process the night's events, but my mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. The reality of my situation seemed like a horrifying nightmare, something I'd wake up from to find myself safe in my tent. But the throbbing pain in my ankle, the chill in my bones, and the eerie silence of the forest were grim reminders of my terrifying reality. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that could hint at the cultist's return, but all I could hear was the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and my own erratic heartbeat. The forest was still again, a stark contrast to the terror I had just experienced. Despite the adrenaline and fear, exhaustion soon took over. My body, beaten and battered from the chase, demanded rest. I wedged myself between two sturdy branches, praying they'd hold my weight through the night. As I stared up at the star-studded sky, I couldn't help but marvel at the surreal contrast of my situation, a beautiful, serene night sky overhead, while beneath it, a terrifying ordeal unfolded. As the hours slipped by, the night's events replayed in my mind, each detail etching itself deeper into my memory. The chilling rituals, the strange symbols, the abandoned campsite, they all painted a horrific picture that sent shivers down my spine. The once welcoming wilderness had revealed a sinister underbelly, yet, amidst the fear and dread, a flicker of resolve began to take root. I was far from helpless. I was a man who had sought solace in nature, who had wanted to test his limits against the raw power of the wilderness. I would not let this horrifying ordeal defeat me. As the moon journeyed across the sky, casting long, twisted shadows onto the forest floor, I clung to my tree, a lone figure in the dark wilderness. The chilling events of the night seemed almost unreal now, the forest around me returning to its normal state. The silence was broken occasionally by the far-off cry of a nightbird or the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. By the time the first hints of dawn began to creep into the sky, I had formulated a basic plan. I would continue moving at first light, aiming to put as much distance as possible between me and the nightmare I had encountered. I was lost, and I was being hunted, but I was far from defeated. The taste of fear was still fresh, but as I looked at the first rays of the sun breaking through the forest canopy, I knew I would fight. I would face whatever came my way and fight to reclaim my journey, to escape the terrifying grip of the Appalachian wilderness. As I waited for dawn, I was filled with a grim determination. I would survive. I had to. As dawn painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, I descended from my treetop sanctuary. Every muscle in my body protested, and my ankle throbbed with renewed intensity. But the promise of daylight, the chance to escape, spurred me on. I was not safe yet, far from it. The wilderness was vast, the cultists persistent. I needed to move to get as far away as possible. I set a steady pace, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the cult. But the forest was serene again, a picture of tranquility. The melodious calls of birds filled the air, a stark contrast to the terrifying silence of the previous night. But underneath this familiar symphony, I sensed the forest's darker secrets. A shiver ran down my spine. I was walking on a thin line between beauty and terror, never knowing when the balance would shift. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Paranoia gnawed at my mind, transforming benign shadows into lurking figures, harmless sounds into ominous footsteps. I felt like a prey in the heart of this wilderness, my senses heightened, my nerves on edge. The forest was dense, its canopy a labyrinth of twisted branches and leaves. The paths were barely visible, a confusing tangle of trails that seemed to lead nowhere. I was deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, far from the usual hiking trails. There was no sign of human presence, just the untouched beauty of nature. And lurking beneath it all was a terror that could shatter the calm at any moment. I continued moving, pushing through the undergrowth, hoping to reach the clearer trails. I drew on my limited knowledge of wilderness survival, trying to orient myself, to find my way out. But with every step, the forest seemed to grow denser, its secrets darker. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, exhaustion crept in. My ankle was swollen now, each step sending sharp jolts of pain shooting up my leg. But I couldn't afford to stop to rest. Fear was my constant companion, pushing me forward, keeping me alert. Despite the dread, there was a part of me that marveled at the wilderness. The towering trees, the chirping birds, the sunbeams filtering through the foliage, they were all breathtaking. I had come here to find solace in this beauty, to escape from the monotony of urban life. But my journey had taken a horrifying turn. I was caught in a twisted game of survival, my peaceful retreat replaced by a deadly pursuit. The irony was not lost on me. The same wilderness that I had sought for peace was now the setting of my worst nightmare. I was a lone figure in this vast expanse, hunted, lost, yet determined to survive. As the day wore on, I could only hope that I was getting closer to escape, that I was putting enough distance between myself and the terror that haunted me. The sun was a steady companion in the sky, casting long shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. The forest was alive with sounds, a symphony that masked the undercurrent of dread. As I limped through the wilderness, a grim determination took hold. I would survive this. I had to, because giving up was not an option, not here, in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I stumbled upon an opening in the dense woodland. The sudden expanse of the clearing caught me by surprise, but what lay at the center froze me in my tracks. My heart pounded against my ribs as I took in the scene before me. It was another circle, just like the one I had witnessed the terrifying ritual at, only this time it was deserted. The faint outlines of symbols, similar to the ones I had seen the previous night, were etched into the ground. I could still smell the remnants of a fire, its ashes cold and gray, a grim reminder of the horror that had taken place here. The memory of the chanting, the ominous figure pointing towards me, the ensuing chase, it all came rushing back. My skin prickled with goosebumps, my breath hitched in my throat. I had stumbled upon another of the cult's sanctuaries, their unholy grounds. I was back at the heart of the nightmare. A shiver of fear ran down my spine as I looked around. The clearing was ominously silent, the trees standing as silent spectators to the horrors that had unfolded here. The thought of being at the heart of the cult's territory, possibly surrounded by them, sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. My first instinct was to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something held me back. There was something eerily familiar about the clearing. I had seen it before the horrors of the cult had unfolded in a different light. It was the same clearing I had planned to camp at, the one that had first lured me off the beaten path. A sense of dread washed over me. I had walked in a circle. Despite my best efforts to move away, to escape the nightmare, I was back where it all started. The realization was a punch to my gut. I was not only lost but moving in circles, right at the heart of the cult's territory. The sinking sun cast long shadows, the coming darkness a grim reminder of the horrors the night could bring. The forest had taken on a sinister tone, every rustle of leaves, every creaking branch sending my heart racing. I was trapped in a horrifying game of cat and mouse, my every step possibly leading me closer to danger. As the twilight gave way to the darkness, my situation became clear. I was not just lost, I was the prey, hunted in a forest that hid a deadly secret. The reality of my situation hit me hard. I was a man alone in the wilderness, caught up in a deadly chase that could cost me my life. The chill of the night settled in, the once comforting wilderness now a haunting labyrinth. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I knew I had to keep moving, to try and break free from this terrifying circle. Fear was my constant companion, pushing me on, reminding me of the horrifying stakes. As I plunged back into the darkness, the cold truth settled in. I was lost in a terrifying nightmare, far from the peaceful retreat I had sought. The Appalachian wilderness was not just a haven, it was a terrifying battleground for my survival. Moving deeper into the forest, a soft murmur broke through the night's silence, a welcome interruption to the forest's eerie quietude. The sound grew louder, turning into a recognizable rush of water. It was a river, its steady flow a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. Stepping through the underbrush, I found myself at the edge of a fast-flowing river, its waters shimmering under the moonlight. Relief washed over me. Rivers often led to human habitation, or at least to clearer trails. It was a glimmer of hope, a chance to find my way out of this nightmare. But the sight of the river also brought back a wave of thirst that hit me like a punch. I had been moving for hours, my water bottle long emptied. I fell to my knees at the riverbank, cupping my hands to drink the cold, refreshing water. As I quenched my thirst, a plan started forming in my mind. I could follow the river. It might lead me to civilization, or at least out of the deep wilderness where I was currently trapped. If the cultists were indeed tracking me, moving along the river could potentially throw them off. The prospect of a plan, a direction, revived my spirits. I wasn't just aimlessly running anymore. I had a course to follow, a goal to achieve. The terror of the chase, the grim reality of my situation, it all seemed a little less overwhelming with a plan in place. I took a moment to breathe, to take in the serene beauty of the river. The moonlight danced on its surface, the gentle rush of water, a soothing symphony. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the terror, to appreciate the beauty that I had initially sought in the Appalachian wilderness. But the peace was short-lived. The grim reality of my situation reared its head again. With a final look at the moonlit river, I pushed off from the bank, starting my trek along the waterway. The forest was dark, its shadows dancing ominously under the faint moonlight, but the river's rush was my constant guide. As I moved, the trees seemed to whisper, their rustling leaves a haunting chorus to the river's symphony. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of underbrush set my nerves on edge. The wilderness was alive with sounds, the dark forest a horrifying maze hiding unseen dangers. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. The river was my path out, my guide through the treacherous wilderness. I held on to that sliver of hope, my resolve strengthening with each passing moment. As I limped along the riverbank, the terrifying reality of the night slowly receded to the back of my mind. I was still lost, still hunted, but I was not defeated. The wilderness had tested me, pushed me to my limits. But I would endure. I had to. As the river whispered its soothing lullaby, I moved forward, driven by the grim determination to survive. Because survival was no longer just a desire, it was a necessity to escape the horrifying grasp of the Appalachian wilderness and the terrifying secret it hid. A sudden rustling sound in the underbrush snapped me out of my exhaustion-induced daze. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Footsteps. The cultists had found me again. Terror gripped me, the river's soothing presence suddenly turning ominous. My brief respite was over. I was being hunted again, chased in the heart of the wilderness, the soothing rush of the river, now a chilling soundtrack to my nightmarish reality. I ran. The sharp pain in my ankle was now a dull throb, my body running on adrenaline. The forest around me blurred, the darkness closing in, the river a steady presence at my side. I didn't dare to look back, the echoes of the pursuing footsteps a horrifying reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. Branches and underbrush whipped at me as I sprinted through the dark forest. I stumbled and fell, picking myself up and forcing my body to keep moving. Every gasp for air was a battle, every step a victory against the mounting pain. The forest was a maze of shadows, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy. The familiar sounds of the wilderness were now muffled, drowned by the rush of the river and the pounding of my heartbeat. I was a lone figure, running through a haunted forest, chased by unseen horrors. Despite the terror, a part of me refused to succumb. I had been hunted, cornered, and lost, but I was not defeated. The wilderness had tested me, pushed me to my limits, revealed horrifying secrets I was never meant to witness. But I would not go down without a fight. I veered away from the river, pushing through the dense underbrush, the distant footsteps echoing my path. I was running blind, guided by fear and adrenaline, driven by a grim determination to survive. The terror of the chase had turned into a terrifying game of endurance, a test of my will to survive. I ran until my legs felt like lead, until my lungs screamed for air. I pushed myself, my body moving on instinct, my mind focused on survival. I could hear the cultists' footsteps growing distant, their pursuit slowed by the rough terrain. But I didn't stop, I couldn't afford to. As the night wore on, I found myself back in the heart of the wilderness, the river a distant murmur, the cultists' footsteps lost in the cacophony of the night. The forest was still again, its peace a stark contrast to the terrifying ordeal I had just endured. Exhausted, I leaned against a tree, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a crushing fatigue. But the fear was still there, a constant reminder of the terrifying chase, of the deadly game I was trapped in. As the reality of my situation set in, I realized how close I had come to being caught. I was lost in the Appalachian wilderness, hunted by a terrifying cult, my every step a fight for survival. But I was still alive. I was beaten, bruised, and terrified, but I was not defeated. And as I leaned against the tree, catching my breath, I clung to that fact. I had survived another night, another chase. I was still in the game, I was still fighting. And I would continue to fight, to endure, until I escaped this horrifying nightmare. The first hint of dawn peeked over the horizon, a faint glimmer of light breaking through the dense canopy. The forest slowly came alive, its nocturnal creatures replaced by the familiar sounds of the morning. But the forest's environment did little to calm my nerves. The chase had left a lingering fear, a constant reminder of the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. Slowly I began my trek, my body aching, my spirit weary but resolved. The fear of being hunted was still there, the echoes of the chase a grim reminder of my nightmarish ordeal. But I was still alive, still standing, and as long as I had a chance to escape this horrifying nightmare. I moved stealthily, careful not to attract any unwanted attention. My senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every distant sound a potential danger. I moved away from the river, deeper into the forest, hoping to evade any cultists that might still be tracking me. Hours turned into an endless cycle of cautious steps, momentary stops, and hasty retreats. But as the sun climbed higher, painting the forest in warm hues, a renewed hope began to simmer within me. The daylight brought with it a sense of safety, a comforting shield against the terrors of the night. I was still lost, still in danger, but I was also moving, fighting, surviving. As the afternoon sun pierced through the canopy, I saw something that almost made me weep with relief. Nestled amidst the dense trees, hidden from casual sight, was an old log cabin, a structure, a man-made structure, in the heart of the wilderness. It was the first sign of human habitation I had seen since I had embarked on this terrifying journey. Cautiously, I approached the cabin. It was old, its wooden exterior weathered by time and nature, but it was sturdy. And more importantly, it was deserted. No cultists, no ominous symbols, just an old, abandoned cabin lost in the wilderness. The cabin was my sanctuary, my temporary haven in the face of danger. It was a place to rest, to gather my strength, to plan my next steps. It was a beacon of hope, a promise of safety in the heart of a terrifying forest. As the day gave way to the evening, I secured the cabin, my exhaustion slowly creeping in, the terror of the chase, the ordeal of the past days, it all weighed heavily on me. But I had made it through another day. I had evaded the cultists, found a sanctuary, survived. I was still in the game, still fighting. As the last rays of the sun disappeared, I huddled in the cabin, its walls a comforting barrier against the terrors lurking outside. The night was still, the forest's haunting symphony replaced by a comforting silence. For the first time since I had stumbled upon the terrifying cult, I felt a sense of security, a brief respite from the horrifying ordeal. I was still lost, still in danger, but for that night I was safe. And as I drifted off to sleep, the echoes of the chase a distant memory, I held on to that fact. I had survived, I was still fighting, and I would continue to fight, continue to endure, until I escaped this horrifying nightmare. Daylight brought a renewed determination. The cabin had served its purpose, a haven, a sanctuary, but it was time to move, to continue my fight for survival. I was still lost, still in danger, but I was alive, I was fighting, and I was not ready to give up. I left the cabin at the crack of dawn, my destination unclear, but my resolve unwavering. The morning was quiet, the forest a maze of shadows and light, its tranquility a stark contrast to the horrors it had witnessed. Hours turned into an endless cycle of cautious steps and stops, the fear of being discovered a constant companion. But as the sun climbed higher, something broke the monotonous rhythm of my trek. It was a faint, distant sound, a familiar hum. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized it, the sound of a vehicle. Quickening my pace, I moved towards the sound, my hopes rising with each step. It grew louder, closer, the unmistakable hum of an engine, the sign of civilization. And then, breaking through the dense undergrowth, I saw it, a dirt road winding its way through the wilderness, a vehicle trundling along it. Relief washed over me as I stumbled onto the road, my knees buckling under the weight of my exhaustion and relief. I was out. I had escaped the dense wilderness, the unseen dangers, the horrifying chase. I was safe. The vehicle stopped, the driver a middle-aged man, his face a mix of surprise and concern. I explained my situation, my voice hoarse, my words barely a whisper. He offered me a ride, his vehicle a beacon of hope, a promise of safety. As we drove down the winding road, the forest receding in the distance, the terror of the past days felt like a distant nightmare. I was leaving it behind, the dense wilderness, the terrifying chase, the horrifying cult. I was going home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, my old truck, just as I had left it. A wave of emotion swept over me as I thanked the driver and climbed into my truck. I was finally safe, finally free. The nightmare was over. I turned the key in the ignition, the truck's familiar hum a comforting sound. As I drove away, the Appalachian wilderness, a distant memory in my rearview mirror, I felt a sense of closure, a sense of survival. I had escaped the clutches of a terrifying cult, survived a horrifying chase, fought my way through a dense, treacherous wilderness. I had survived. As I drove home, the memories of the past days, a grim reminder of the horrors I had witnessed, I made a vow. I would never return to those woods again. I would never forget the terror, the chase, the nightmare, but I would move on, carry on, survive, because I had fought, endured, and survived. And that was something worth cherishing. The Appalachian wilderness held a terrifying secret, a horrifying cult hidden in its dense, treacherous undergrowth. I had stumbled upon it, survived it, escaped it, and as I drove away, leaving the wilderness behind, I knew one thing. I had survived. I had fought, endured, and I had survived. And that was a victory worth celebrating. My dearest Aiden, I know that it has been some time since we last spoke, and for that, I know better than to ask for any forgiveness. As a mother, I'm charged with certain responsibilities to you for which I openly admit in failing to provide. I understand that you don't know many of the reasons as to why I've done the things that I have, and I know that it's pointless to try to get you to understand. Please know that none of this was ever your fault. You are an amazing young man, and the best thing that I've ever made in this world. You were never, and could never be a burden on my life. It's just that in those last few years since your father passed, I felt like there was a part of my soul that went with him. You know that we were never much of a religious home, so faith was something I never could really turn to in those days. But when I found Lucardio, it was like everything changed. I felt connected to something bigger than myself for the first time in my life. That's how we all feel, each and every one of us that has been here since the beginning. Now, while the years away from you have been hard, they've also been a learning experience, unlike any other. I've grown in connection and understanding to the world around me and my higher power. You're probably thinking to yourself that you should have been what I should have been connecting with and understanding more, and you're right to do so. But I want you to know that I thought about you every single day. I don't know of a single parent amongst our congregation who wasn't doing the same for their own child. In the beginning, keeping contact was simply impossible due to how frequently we migrated from town to town, from county to county, and from state to state. One night we'd settle down with our tents in Tampa, and then just a few days later we'd be sleeping under the stars of Dallas. We moved so often not to be undetectable by our loved ones, but to spread Lucardio's message to as many as we could. For the first few years, we lived off donations alone. On occasion, we would work odd jobs around the towns we were in, but only to get what we needed to keep going on. We finally settled into a lasting abode and made the foundation of our church 3 years ago, and I've been putting this letter off ever since then. Every time I tried to put pen to paper, I just could never stop myself crying. And yes, I don't deserve to shed a single tear after all the pain I must have caused. Lucardio has always taught that personal wants and connections were taught to stand in the way of the mission. We've all had to make sacrifices along the way, but we made them because we truly believe in what we are doing. I can't imagine the sacrifices you've had to make with me gone as well, sacrifices you never should have had to make in my absence. While I have no right at all to ask for your trust, I do want you to know that I believe with all my heart that we will be together again. I'm not simply talking about you and I, but all of us, our entire family. I've seen clearer than ever that the day is coming when we shall all be reunited in a world that is made pure in our Lord's image. I can say this with a resounding certainty because through the work of the congregation, I have seen wonders made only possible in dreams. Know that I have always kept you closest to my heart. Know that I do love you more than you will ever know. Know that I am sorry for all the pain that I have caused and pray for you every single day. Love, Mom. Those were the first and last words I had heard from my mother in 2 decades. 6 months after my father died from pancreatic cancer, she just up and left without even saying a proper goodbye. She'd of course been distant in the time leading up to her departure. I never held that against her because while I had lost my dad who'd I'd known for my entire life, she had lost the man she'd been with for over 37 years. Because I was only 21 at the time of his passing, I didn't really know how to properly process the grief when we lost him. I dropped out of community college and pretty much just buried myself with extra shifts at the local deli where I worked just so I could keep myself busy and not have any time to really think about the whole situation. Mom had taken up counseling at my request as I knew that Dad would have wanted her not to fall off the wagon and relapse after 2 decades of sobriety. Under her therapist's advice, she started volunteering with more programs in the community. She'd sit in and help out at the nursing home, as well as set up for NA and AA meetings at the wellness center, and even help with driving the van to pick up attendees who didn't have any transportation to them. But like me, as soon as each busy day came to its end, the reality of my father's absence filled our home like a reservoir of grief that knew no end. The recliner where he sat in the living room was never touched and hardly even looked at. It was treated like some kind of pitiful memorial that only served as a reminder that he wasn't coming back. Gone were the days of the family coming together after dinner and binging the latest hit show on cable or laughing together when watching America's funniest home videos. Now, there was simply silence as Mom would just sit on the couch reading over $1.10 mystery paperbacks while I emotionally quarantined myself in my room. I suppose in those days it was hard for us to be around one another, not because we had done something to upset the other, but because we both served as reminders of the one we had lost. To my mother, I was almost the spitting image of my father at the age when they had first met back in high school. For me, she was the remaining fragment of a home that was now forever broken, always feeling as if his phantom was still holding her empty hand. I often ask myself what would have happened if I had only tried to make an effort in grieving along with her, rather than alone. Perhaps things may have played out entirely differently and she'd still be home, and maybe I'd still be the man I once was in those days, rather than the man teetering on the edge of insanity as I am today. Yet to question the possibility of correcting past regrets is a waste of time, for by the time I had begun to realize what was going on with my mother, it was already too late. A month before she left, I noticed that she had begun to frequent the Ericsburg Recreation Center. There had been pamphlets scattered around town advertising a new method of spiritual and philosophical healing for those suffering with depression and mental ailments. Personally, I had just chalked it up to some kind of traveling hippie convert that would try to sell you the idea of magic healing crystals and positive energy chakras, or some crap like that. At first, I figured the only reason Mom had been going to those meetings was simply because her sponsor asked her to tag along. Now, while that may indeed have been her initial introduction to Lecardio Carbone, it was his captivating charismatic message that had ensnared her, along with the rest of what would come to be later known as the congregation. As I've come to learn following the years of research I've done since she vanished, the congregation went on a type of cross-country tour during its early development in the late 1980s. In total, they were able to gather roughly 40 members, after dozens of others would tend to drop out after just a few months or so. Based on the scarce interviews I could find from former followers of the group, it seemed that what began as a method of mental healing quickly grew into a religious ideology in itself. While details about the actual faith of the congregation were scarce, what was known was that their leader taught from fragments of several different religious texts like the Bible, Torah, and Quran, as well as inserting their own differentiating doctrines of their own. The most I was able to learn during my research came from articles covering the experience of a man by the name of Aaron Lattimore, a member from 1986 to 1991. According to Mr. Lattimore, they believed a rather strict celibate and isolationist lifestyle. The whole idea of their doctrine was based on focusing on the individual to become more of an instrument for higher power, as opposed to focusing on their own happiness and self-determination. Apparently, one of the very first things each member had to adapt to during early indoctrination was losing touch with personal connections such as family and friends, as they were seen as nothing more than roadblocks keeping them from their destiny. While it was clear that they were most definitely being conditioned and brainwashed via religious repertoire to see the world from that weird and twisted view, I'd be lying if I didn't say that it was still a massive knife to the heart to think about my mother viewing me as some kind of obstacle in her life. So you can imagine my surprise when I received her letter from out of nowhere after nearly 18 years of silence. Upon reading it, I was shocked to discover for myself just how easily decades of built-up emotions could just burst to the forefront in the blink of an eye. Each word brought on the memories of panic, fear, and loneliness that had enveloped my entire being when she first left all those years ago. I had worked so hard in the time between to grow as a man and not let the loss of both my parents define me. In a way, I had lived as if they were both dead. There was that equal certainty that I'd never see either one of them ever again. And yet there I was in my apartment reading a message from the necrotic past that I had tried my best to bury. What shocked me the most was the lack of any real rage at the time. In the early years, I had always imagined her just showing up out of the blue after their church collapsed and broke away. Every single one of those scenarios ended with some giant and emotional speech telling her off and condemning her for the hell she put me through while all on my own. Yet rather than the feeling of anger festering to the surface, I was struck by only fear. Because this wasn't the time when small cults and religious nomads were recruiting for their holy cause. This was the age when they were all succumbing to self-martyrdom. Immediately my mind raced over images of the Jonestown Massacre, or the Heaven's Gate passings, and even the Solar Temple, all tied up with a neat bow of the Waco Inferno. All I could think of as I finished her letter were police investigators taking pictures of her body, surrounded by the dozens of others she had left me to worship with. The thought of her rotting sprawled out over some twisted version of hallowed ground, while flies buzzed around her head like a kind of demonic halo, made me sick to my stomach to the point where I almost doubled over the kitchen table there and then, which is why I decided to take that weekend off work and make my way down there to this congregation for myself. At the time, I had hoped to maybe get there before the horrible event in my imagination played out, even though there was still that gnawing voice in the back of my head saying that it had already happened and that I'd simply be the poor soul to beat the police to an unimaginable scene. In a way, that voice was right. According to the envelope in which my mother's letter had been enclosed within, it had been sent by a Glenn Dickerson from Harlington, Montana. So the first order of business was to take the 16-hour drive up there and figure out his relationship to my mother. Along the way, I was trying to wrap my head around all the questions that would remain impossible to answer until I arrived. Why did my mother suddenly send me this from out of nowhere? Why did this person I'd never heard of in my entire life send me her letter rather than her doing it herself? Is she still alive? While it's clear to any observer of the situation that to plague oneself with these questions would be useless and only serve to heighten the stress of the situation, it's much easier said than done when you're the one living through that earth-shattering shadow of anxiety without answers. While making the trip, I had decided to listen to some sermons from the congregation that they had posted on their website. I figured that even though I had listened to them all before, that I might as well get a refresher course on them, given the circumstances. Let us not forget our place among the stars, for we are but an atom atop a speck of dust within this vast universe. Yet despair not, for your role is greater than you may ever know. For despite the barren and empty cosmos that surrounds us all, you are unique. You are alive. Unlike the countless desolate worlds that swim throughout the dark wilderness of dead space, ours has the ability to ponder its very own existence. While life may be as fleeting as a decaying vapor in the wind, it is one not without a purpose. But where does such a mystery of life come from, you may ask? What makes us so special that we are able to rise from the depths of evolution and aspire to take our first steps from our nest of Earth into a universe that seems infinitely inhospitable to life itself? Many have sought answers in science or philosophy, while others have looked into the pages of holy books written thousands of years ago, when the simplest answer of all is to look up at the stars themselves, for they are the true inspirational word of God. Since man has first made fire, he has gazed up at the dark horizons in curious amazement at the hand that painted those mysterious campfires that dot the night sky. Our ancestors saw for the first time their insignificance in the scale of all things, but also a deeper connection to the reality around them. Each and every one of us have looked up to the heavens in search for answers, yet only a select few have found traces of those answers. Abraham, Moses, Paul, John the Revelator, Muhammad, and Buddha, they were all given pieces of the great puzzle that defines our entire reality. Little by little the truth has been given to us as a species, for we must grow as a society and a people, so that we may mature enough to understand the true meaning of our lives. Yet there are those who would seek to pollute the veridity of these answers with their own fan-fictional truths. The Joseph Smiths, the Jim Jones, the Marshall Applewhites, the Joseph Mambros, all of them taking the great revelations bestowed to us by the highest power and discarding them and reshaping and contradicting them to suit their own worldview rather than the true worldview. Now you may ask who I am to make such a claim as I do. Who is this man that tarnishes the names of other failed and ridiculed religious leaders, yet claims that he knows the way as opposed to them? I'm here to tell you that what you're asking is the most important question that must be answered before you're even able to receive my message. What use is a shepherd if there's no reason for the flock to follow him? Please, let not my words be what bring you to the path of salvation, but only be the stepping stone that leads you to the truth. For simple silver-tongued words are wielded by many and have led millions astray. All members of our congregation have seen the truth for themselves. They have seen the signs and witnessed firsthand the wonders of what lies in store for the faithful. Because we are not some random and misguided accident to simply be forgotten by the universe once it succumbs to the heat death of cosmic entropy, we are, all of us, a part of a greater and glorious whole. Yet at the same time, we are not to be simple individuals that seek to only serve our own wants and desires for the brief duration of our mortal lives here on earth. In truth, we are to be instruments orchestrated by the hand that has painted the greatest canvas of stardust that is the heavens themselves. Our individuality must be swallowed whole by the grand collective design, our lives to be a drop in the ocean that is the unfathomable existence of God. For we do nor circumvent the truth of our reality. We do not bend to the words of man. We bow to the other light. We worship the true light. Now I had to give the man credit where credit was due. He sure knew how to talk. Listening to him again, it wasn't a wonder as to why so many like my mother decided to follow him. The unfortunate truth about the world we live in seems to be that those who are lost and suffering are the easiest prey to those who seek to exploit them. I couldn't even begin to imagine how she and the others had been used by the one who claimed to be their shepherd. I couldn't help but think of the Branch Davidians and how all of the women had been made to marry David Koresh and bear his children. Just the thought of my mother being manipulated into that kind of mindset and having to sleep with some silver-tongued bastard who used my father's death as a way to seep into her life made me so angry that I could have indented my damn steering wheel with how tight I had been gripping it. Even though they appeared to be a celibate group based on what I had heard from former members, there was no telling what really happened behind closed doors when a religious leader got too much power in his pulpit. After all, Catholic priests were meant to live the same kind of lifestyle, And God only knows how many innocent kids have suffered under the force of those men who twisted their faith into a tool for their own self-satisfaction. As I made my way closer to my destination, I was shocked by the sheer scale of some of the farms and ranches that I passed by along the way. I couldn't even begin to imagine the kind of money some of these families were sitting on in their fancy estates along the Rocky Mountains. The small town of Harlington itself was as fresh a breath of air as the entire countryside around me. It was a perfect little slice of Americana, as pristine as fresh apple pie, fresh paved roads and brick outlet stores lined along Main Street with bright American flags waving in the warm summer air by lampposts. For many, it would appear to be the perfect suburban home to settle down and raise a family, the kind of place where everyone knows everybody and the marble white church is filled to the brim every Sunday. For me, the town had an unfortunate shadow over the whole thing, obscuring the serene beauty with an underlying sense of dread for the secrets I was seeking answers for. My final stop would be at the Huxler Diner, which lay right across the street from the Harlington High School football stadium. Now I must confess that the last thing I was expecting when I put in the sender's address for my mother's letter was to be directed to some dinner from some town I'd never heard of in the middle of Montana. Yet here I finally was at the end of my long journey, on the complete other end of the country. Upon entering the diner, I wasn't surprised at all to find the layout to be as classical as you could possibly expect. It was almost like walking right into the past with the checkered tiled floor and red leather booths. The smell of coffee and patty grease filled the air as tunes from the early 70s melted out from a jukebox at the wall between the two single-stall bathrooms. As the bell above the front door jingled when I walked through, a waitress in a checkered blue and white dress and apron came up to me. "Hey there, welcome to Huxler's. Can I get you something, hun?" "Yeah, I'm looking for Glenn Dickerson. Does he happen to be here by chance?" "Oh sure. Glenn's in the back. If you take a seat, I'll go get him for you. Sit anywhere you like." As I thanked her, I made my way over to a booth at the end of the diner. Given the probable nature of our conversation, I wanted to make sure that it was as remote as possible. I had been a little too focused on thinking about how to start my conversation that I almost jumped right out of my seat when the waitress came back. "Oh, sorry to scare you, hun," she said with a giggle. "Oh no, you're fine. It's just been a long drive, that's all. Well, Glenn will be over here in just a sec. Could I get you a coffee while you wait? It's on the house." "Sure, I'll just take it black, thanks." "All right, I'll be back in a jiffy." As she left, I pulled out my mother's letter and laid it out on the table. There was part of me just thinking that this whole thing was a pointless exercise in a wild goose chase and a waste of gas, and that I should just get back in my car and continue living my life as I had ever since she left. Yet that voice was the minority in a raging internal argument that I'd been having with myself for nearly 20 years. After about 10 minutes, an older, somewhat heavy-set man came out from the kitchen door. He looked to be in his mid-60s, the graying of his hair obscured by the net he wore over it. As soon as his eyes locked with mine, his entire demeanor changed instantly. For a moment, he just stood there until taking a deep breath and then walking slowly over to me. As he came over to the table, I stood up awkwardly and reached my hand out. "Glenn Dickerson?" I asked. "You're Paula's boy, right?" He replied as he shook my hand softly. "Yeah," I said softly, somewhat relieved that he was the one who got the ball rolling. "Well, go on and have a seat," he said, motioning back to the table. "I'm sure you've got some questions, and I'll do my best to answer what I can." As I received my coffee and was now alone with Mr. Dickerson, we got down to business. "So, how did you know your mother?" he said, finishing my question for me, to which I nodded. For a moment, his eyes wandered as he tried to figure out exactly where it was he needed to really start. "Well, she and the rest of her group moved into the old Bancroft property about 3 years ago. It had been used as a psych ward back in the 30s and was shut down in '68, pretty much left abandoned since then. They all came in, bought the property from the state with cash, and spent about a good year refurbishing the place themselves. That whole first year they lived mostly in tents around the property and would come down occasionally to purchase goods and so on. A few of them would come by here for a bite every now and then. Your mother was one of the more prominent visitors, talked about you a lot." "Did she?" I said, more as one last silent jab at her, rather than a real question. "Yep," he replied with a nod of his head. "If what she told me was true, then you've got every right to be mad. I don't blame you one bit, but if it's any consolation, she always talked about missing the hell out of you. Then she should have just come home," I said to myself under my breath. "Yep, that's exactly what she used to say." "Wait, really?" She said that. The day she gave me that, he said, pointing to the letter. What happened? I asked, now much more seriously in the conversation now. Well, like I said, they moved in about 3 years ago, but around a year and a half ago, their ventures into town became much fewer and far between. I'd maybe see Paula every 5 or 6 months. That all started around the same time they stopped letting people up to Bacroft. Wait, they stopped letting people go up there? I thought their whole thing was them wanting more people in their cult, or whatever you want to call it. Nope, like you said, it's a cult cut and dry. And yeah, when they first got the place fixed up and moved in, they invited everyone to come up and hear their message. Most went just to see how the eyesore on the mountain had been spruced up. Then they just shut the gates and pretty much kept to themselves. They'd planted this big garden and were self-sufficient at that point, only really coming down in pairs of 2 when they needed tools or so on. She'd come down a handful of times just to chat. I guess when you're cooped up in one big manor with 60 of the same people day in and day out, you get a hankering for some new conversations. So she really said that she should have come home, I asked, trying to steer the conversation back to where I needed it to go. She did. She came by a month ago and just seemed really out of sorts. She talked about how she wished she had gone home years ago to be with you, but that there was some kind of thing going on with their congregation or whatever that was too important. That's when she gave me the letter and asked me to send it. I don't know really what was wrong. She seemed like she was really happy and sad at the same time. And you said it was a month ago. Give or take. I'd say about 3 weeks. Definitely not longer than 4. And have you seen any more of them since then? I asked. Nope. But then again, that's not off par with how they've been recently. Like I said, over the past year or so, they've been pretty scarce around town. So she didn't really say anything other than that? Not really, no. The only other thing was when I asked her why she wanted me to send the letter out rather than her. She said that if you received a letter in her own name, that there'd be a good chance you'd just chuck it in the bin. She just wanted to make sure that you had an actual chance at opening it. That somewhat put my mind at ease, mainly because the logic of that made sense. It seemed pretty reasonable that she'd have someone else reach out to me with her message, especially if she thought that I still just hated her guts and wouldn't give it a second glance. The only thing that still didn't make sense was the timing of it all. Why suddenly, after 20 years of nothing, would she have bothered to reach out in the first place? You okay, kid? It's a lot to take in, I'm sure. It wasn't until he spoke again that I realized I had just been sitting there in complete sense for what must have been a few minutes at the least, just staring off into nothingness as my mind tried to fit the pieces together. What? Oh yeah, I'm all right, I replied, coming back to the present. I'm just trying to figure out why she'd do this now. I mean, the entire ride up here, I just kept thinking that something bad had happened. I know what you mean, he said. Sometimes the straw just breaks the camel's back. Maybe there doesn't need to be some worrisome reason. Maybe she's just finally had enough and wanted to say something or reach out. Do you think there's a shot of me maybe going up there and seeing if I can see her myself? I know you said they closed the gates a while back, but maybe they'd make some kind of exception for me. You know, because I'm family, I asked. To answer my questions, he gave his eyes a long and tiresome rub. I could see him mulling over the thought with a generous amount of contemplation before finally arriving at a conclusion. In all honesty, I'd say the odds are about 50-50. I know they ain't big on family connections in their little group, but then again, I'm not sure how much pull your mom has with them. Your only big obstacle is just getting in there, of course, especially ever since they shut the gates to outsiders. To be fair, he had a rather good point on the matter, which unfortunately didn't help the situation. As I left the diner after the end of our conversation, I felt like I walked out of there with many more questions than answers. To make matters worse, there really wasn't any way I could try to find out without directly trying to go up there myself. I couldn't just go to the police about it, given that the already reclusive members of the congregation, not being seen in several weeks or months, was the normal stats of things around here. I had already decided before walking out of there that my best option would just be to try and go up there myself. Reluctantly, Glenn had pointed me in the direction of the Bancroft estate. When standing in town looking up at it, it appeared as a small crimson dot atop the peak of the mountain range due west. So with nowhere else to turn other than my own plan, I made the drive up the dirt road that had been carved out along the mountain itself. Given that I already had a decent fear of heights, the drive up towards the manor was already anxiety-inducing enough, but the lack of any support rails that accompanied the steep turns along the road only added to agitation. As I came onto the final stretch towards the estate itself, the dirt road evolved into one of dark gravel. After about 100 feet, I came to an old iron gate and matching fence that seemed to stretch and encompass the entire perimeter of the property. The words Bancroft Psychiatric Hospital were adorned above the arching gate entrance. I thought it odd at the time, wondering why they would go to such trouble with renovating the property and never even changing the wording at the front gate itself. For a moment, I chuckled at the thought of there being no more fitting place for a cult to set up shop than a loony bin itself. That was quickly replaced by the grim reality that my mother was now one of its residents. While the iron rod entryway was indeed closed, I was somewhat surprised to see that there was only one small latch that kept the gate shut. With simply flipping it up, it opened with a slow, groaning creak. It was maybe a 20-yard walk from the gate towards the front steps of the estate, and given the lack of any sign of any other vehicles on the face of the property, I decided to take the rest of the journey on foot. The manor itself was an impressive sight all on its own. A hefty brick foundation gave rise to freshly painted red vinyl siding. It looked less like an old hospital from the 40s, and more like a revamped take on a plantation home you'd find in the deep south. Two large, 3-story wings branched off from the central base of the mansion, and seemed to expand further on in the back of the property. The wings themselves appeared to have been additions to the main residence, which stood 4 stories tall, and would be an impressive living space even on its own. In front of this new religious abode were rows and rows of well-kept gardens that had begun to show the signs of the coming harvest. Fresh tomatoes, corn, cabbage, and beans had started to bud and ripen. The only thing that seemed to be missing was the people themselves. Given how many had been assumed to be living here, I'd imagined there'd have been at least a few outside, either tending to the garden or simply enjoying the fresh afternoon air. Figuring that I'd already come this far, I decided to go on up and see if I'd be welcomed inside, or if there was even anyone to let me in. The front doors seemed to be the newest addition to the home that I could see from the outside. Matching stained glass windows adorned the 2 of them, depicting an elongated red diamond in the center, surrounded by swirling colors of blues, oranges, and greens. With the lack of any knockers or a doorbell of any kind, I knocked a few times on the crimson-painted doors and awaited an answer. After a few moments of silence, I knocked again. With yet another response of nothingness, I took a deep breath and prayed to a god I didn't believe in, and gripped one of the freshly polished silver door handles. With the surprise of it actually turning all the way and opening up, I peered my head inside as I prepared to make my way inside. Once I had passed through the threshold, it was very clear where all the hard work and renovations had gone into when building the place back up. It was like taking one step from the 21st century and walking back in time to an elegant mansion in the late 1800s. Freshly mopped hardwood floors lined the ground level, while well-kept antique furniture lined beige-painted walls. An elegant crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling and emanated a warm and welcoming atmosphere of light that made me feel surprisingly welcome, despite there being no actual welcoming of any individual whatsoever. At the moment, the only company I found was that of the echoes of my own footsteps. Within the foyer, 2 long hallways extended on either side, leading into what I assumed to be the separate expansions of the property. Directly opposite the door was a spiral staircase that led to the 2nd level. For a moment, I simply stood there, not knowing whether to continue as I was or to simply call out and see if someone would answer. Deciding that it was best to keep my attendance here as discreet as I already had thus far, I made my way up the stairs without a word. Along the 2nd level, the hardwood floors of the 1st had been replaced by a bright red carpet that stretched along a corridor leading deeper into the manor. Along both sides of the walls was a long series of matching doors of polished black ghostwood opposite one another. Each one was identified by engraved plaques with what appeared to be the first name of its intended occupant etched in gold. I continued along the classical hotel-like hallway, searching plate to plate until I found the one I had been looking for. After nearly 24 doors, I stopped in front of the one that had my mother's name engraved on its surface. I stood there for a long moment, my hand frozen right above the handle. At the time, the only thing going through my mind were the news reports that had come out of Santa Fe, California, just a few years earlier. Like everyone else at the time, I'd watched the footage of the Heaven's Gate victims lying in their beds with cloth carefully draped over their bodies. Under the leadership of their self-proclaimed alien messiah, they had all offed themselves in an attempt to reach what they deemed as the next level of this existence. The final acts of their religious journey had come to an end in their own beds, covering themselves to spare the rotting sight of those who would come to find them. Is that what lay beyond this very door? Was simply turning the handle and pressing forward no different than opening a freshly unearthed coffin? The thought of walking in to see her graying remains covered by a thin sheet with the smell of decaying flesh filling the air made me nauseated. You came here to find answers, didn't you? I asked myself, to which I obviously knew the answer. After taking another moment in a deep breath, I clenched the handle and pushed onwards. Slowly entering the room, I was relieved to find that the only aroma to greet me in the air was that of lavender. Her room was pristine and well kept, keeping with the same classical design as the rest of the manor. A large dressing table sat opposite of her Victorian upholstered queen-size bed, which was thankfully empty of anything other than already made bedsheets. Half-used scented candles were strewn across various small cabinets and tables along the walls of the room, most of their wicks blackened from recent use. Yet other than the name along the door, there didn't seem to be a single item within her room to show that it had actually belonged to my mother. There weren't any personal mementos anywhere in sight, not even as much as a picture. The whole room was more akin to the kind you'd see in a fancy inn or high-end bed and breakfast. In the entirety of her chambers, the only thing that stood out was what at first glance appeared to be a type of oil lantern on her nightstand. It gave off a faint and almost mesmerizing bright teal glow that flickered with the passage of time. As I walked over to it for closer inspection, I saw that the light wasn't produced by a flame at all. Rather, it was created by a thin crystal shard that was suspended in the glass core of the lantern. While I originally believed it to be some kind of fancy electric light that you'd find online, this was completely standing on its own without any sign of a plug or outlet. There also were no indications of an area for batteries to be placed anywhere on the lantern's surface. As I carefully lifted it up to see if there was a compartment underneath, I nearly dropped and shattered the whole thing as a light shock zapped my fingers as I made contact with it. As I did so, the light within the crystal pulsed just a tad brighter, and with it came a small but noticeable humming sound that seemed to come from the shard. While there was no real pain, I was surprised to find that most of my hand had gone numb, as if it was asleep. I tried to move and flex my fingers to get the feeling back into it, but to hardly any success. There was a kind of electric tingling that I could feel buzzing down in the very bones of my hand, a buzzing that seemed to resonate with the pulsing humming of the lamp. After a few moments, the feeling started to return. As it did so, the pulsating droning of the crystal began to subside back to its original state before I interacted with it. I figured that must be the way this crazy thing charged, maybe by somehow borrowing the electricity of the user. While it may haven't been anything I'd have ever seen before, it was perhaps the craziest bedside night light I'd ever seen. The unfortunate truth was that other than a twisted glowing appliance, there wasn't a single answer about where my mother was, or the rest of the congregation for that matter. As I left her room more confused than when I had come in, I decided that the best hope I had for some kind of explanation on the residence level of the manor would be to find the chambers of the group's leader, Licardio Carbone. After about 10 minutes of wandering around aimlessly throughout the crossword rows of hallways, I finally found it at the end of an empty corridor. Unlike the other doors, this one was painted in a deep scarlet, with a black diamond stretched out vertically decal plastered over it. There was this strong kind of authority that permeated the atmosphere around it. With the lack of any other rooms along the walls of this hallway, the respect and reverence for their leader was clearly shown. While some would imagine that I'd be just as hesitant to open this door as I was my mother's, I was far more interested and determined to get a peek into the life of the man who snatched my mother and dozens of others into his little convert. The inside of his chambers couldn't have been any more different than that of my mother's. This room was more akin to a large office chamber rather than one's living space. A large oak desk stood a few feet away from the entrance. Behind the desk were rows upon rows of bookshelves filled with identical-looking black leather books. To the left of the room was a small bed with a single velvet pillow. On the right side there were a few desks and filing cabinets, yet hanging above them was a large painting encased in a bright gold frame. The painting showed a depiction of the Earth you'd be likely to find at a flat Earth convention. A circular leveled representation of our world lay hovering in space. Beneath it were four similar-looking figures. They were humanoid in shape, yet had hooves rather than legs. Two long curved horns protruded from their heads, and a pair of marble white wings stretched out from their backs. One had the face of a man, one had the face of an ox, one had the face of a lion, one had the face of an ox, and one had the face of an eagle. All four of them knelt with their arms upwards, struggling to hold the weight of the world on their shoulders. The image reminded me of the kind of drawings I had seen of how ancient cultures used to believe that the world was carried on the backs of elephants who stood on the shell of a turtle. This kind of thinking seemed to line up pretty well for a reclusive religious cult. As I made my way further in the study, I noticed that on the desk lay another one of those glowing crystal lanterns, along with a single thick hardback book. Its cover was nearly blank, except for a similar crimson diamond symbol that I had seen a few times since entering this strange place. Adorned above the symbol were the words "The Other Light." It looked to be old, much older than the cult itself since its formation several decades ago. From a glance, I assumed it to be the holy book that was used for the congregation's teachings. I had to give credit where credit was due, though, while most religious cults just twisted the words of the already pre-established scriptures. At least this one put in the effort to completely create their own. Although I was surprised that when I opened it, the text was in some kind of gibberish language that was made up of vibrant and detailed scribbles and symbols like I had never seen before. The closest thing I could try to compare them to would be that of Arabic or Hebrew, but they were still far more elaborate in their individual design than any dialect that had been written before. Each and every symbol was more of an impressive work of art rather than translations of things as simple as mere words. Page after page, they filled the book with unknowable stories and proverbs, and it was only when looking over this beautiful literature that I wondered what kind of man would even be able to translate it. Yet at the time, I thought that it was more likely that he had pretended to do so. Yet if that was really the case, then where did this book come from? Placing it back down on the shelf, I then turned towards the bookshelf behind the desk. Each row had been organized based on alphabetical markers at the bottom of each shelf. While there was nothing written on the spines of the books, I still traced along the order until I found the H section. I then removed the first book from that aisle and saw Pauline Halt imprinted on the cover. When I looked through it, I saw detailed notes covering her entire life. High school and college transcripts, tax records, and even medical reports were all also piled together within this novellic dossier on my mother. The most disturbing part of the whole thing was when I turned over towards the back and found a section covering the greatest threats to her continued faith. To my surprise, I was the only mention on that list. What was surprising, however, was that what followed was a thorough compilation of entries about everything I had been up to and doing since she left me. There were lists of the places I had been employed, how I had coped with my mother's immediate absence, the counselors I had met with over the past 10 years, likely political affiliations based on social media activity. They even had it down to the restaurants that I most frequented the most often. I don't know what was worse, the fact that they felt the need to have this much information about me, or that they had the means to do so without me even knowing about it. It was only when I closed the book that I realized that my hands had been trembling, although this wasn't with fear, but anger, given this wildly invasive incursion into my family's privacy. I couldn't even begin to imagine the kind of information stuffed into the rest of the collection on the shelves. As I looked over each one of them, the only thing I wanted there and then was to just walk out of that room and never go in there again. As I left the study, I gave one last look at the mysterious, unknown holy book of the Other Light. While I didn't touch it ever again, I made sure to slip the biography of my mother and myself into my jacket as I walked out. With nothing else of informational value in this part of the mansion, I decided to make my way back down the stairs onto the ground level. While I was thankful that I hadn't yet stumbled upon some gathering of dead bodies while searching the place, I only became more and more perplexed as to the whereabouts of everyone. I would only come to start to realize the truth when I stumbled upon what obviously served as the nave for their religious gatherings. What originally appeared to be the cafeteria of the psychiatric hospital had been converted into the kind of layout you'd see from a community college auditorium. Several rows of folding chairs stood before a raised platform with a neatly assembled podium. Behind the podium was a projector screen, which had an image of a group photo of the entire congregation cast over it. They were all standing at the front steps of the manor, wearing matching white polos and dress pants. It was rather surreal to be able to instantly pick her out of the lineup, especially given the fact that she looked like she hadn't seemed to have aged a day since she had left me. Perhaps the most alien aspect of it all was to see her smiling, especially given that the last memories I had of her were just from a mask of depression. As I stood there looking at her picture up there, I couldn't help but feel a slight tinge of guilt for coming all the way over here if nothing was actually wrong. She seemed to be happy, really happy. She appeared to have moved on as I also did, yet she still sent me that letter and was still nowhere to be seen. This parade of confusion continued along as I felt a slight gust of air coming through an open door towards the back right-hand side of the nave. As I followed the source of it, I noticed that the sign above the door labeled it as the entrance to the main chapel, which I found as odd as I had figured that the auditorium I was currently in was what passed as their main room of worship. Passing through the door, I realized that it led only to a set of stairs that descended downwards into unknown chambers of darkness that knew no source of illumination. Pulling out my phone and flipping on the flashlight, I made my way down. Carried along the cool breeze was the kind of dank and earthy smells that was only accommodated by the memories of childhood home basements. Although I still had absolutely no idea where that damp wind was coming from, especially given how deep these stairs seemed to be declining down towards, I had been walking down what had easily been 5 minutes and still absolutely no sign of a platform or ending in sight. As I turned and looked back up, I was greeted with that same tunnel of blackness leading back up to the manor. Standing there in that obscenely long stone stairwell, I found myself right back to my childhood, where like every other at that age, I had that terrifying irrational fear of the dark. It suddenly became so claustrophobic, except rather than tight physical spaces, it was the two walls of blackness swallowing up the tiny bastion of light that existed solely due to my phone. Looking back down for a moment, I decided that perhaps it would be better to just go back up to the manor itself and simply wait to see if anyone else eventually came back. Yet as soon as I went to walk back up, I was hit with this sudden wave of lightheadedness. I tried to steady myself for a moment, chopping it up to possible vertigo or maybe even fatigue from stress. When I tried to take another step up, my head began to feel like it was buzzing, like the kind of sensation one gets as being administered general anesthesia. As my grasp on reality was quickly fleeting, I began to panic and hyperventilate. Everything started to spin to the point where it was impossible to discern the darkness from the light as it all blended together through a mind that could no longer properly comprehend the signals being sent from my eyes. The final nail in the coffin of my failing senses would be when my hearing became completely distorted, as if I was hearing my panting breaths through water. I tried to shout out for help, only to hear my severely muffled echoes through the black emptiness. Then, without warning, everything went blank. I woke up with a blistering migraine that seemed to envelop the entire left side of my head. It was only when I reached my hand up to cradle it that I realized that every single part of my body groaned in the protest of pain with even the slightest movement. I took a long few minutes to try and get a hold of my surroundings and current situation. My phone was nowhere in sight. It was rather clear that I must have dropped it when I passed out and took my rather painful tumble down the steps, down to wherever I now seemed to be. The stairs were right towards my right where I laid, and led back up to that uncomfortable darkness where I had no desire to venture back into again. Yet it was only looking back into that black void that I realized that my surroundings actually had some kind of illumination. I seemed to be in some kind of large section of a cave formation that had been carved out enough to allow for the steps to beach through into it. As my eyes strained to see through the thumping headache, I noticed veins of crystalline geodes along the ceiling of the cave. They emanated that same type of eerie green light that had come from those lanterns I had seen in the living quarters. While I had never heard of any kind of natural luminescent stones before, that didn't necessarily mean that they didn't exist as they clearly looked to be. Not only was I thankful for some light, however weird it may be, I was mainly relieved due to the fact that it was bright enough to see while not being intense enough to strain my eyes. In fact, I found that the longer I looked into those soft streams of crystalline light, the more the pain in my head began to subside with each passing second. Not only that, but while the pain all along my body was still very much present, it was now more of the kind of all-encompassing pain of soreness that one would suffer through after a day of long and rigorous workout routines. After struggling for a short time, I was finally able to get back up on my feet. While there were several different branching tunnels from the chamber I was currently in, it was on the dusty rock floor that I found the first real sign of an answer. Through the light, I could just barely make out several tracks of footprints, which led through a more narrow pathway in the rock walls. With myself deeper into this situation, as well as the earth itself than I ever intended to be, it was clear that the only way now was forward. Slowly but surely, I made my way deeper through the natural stone maze of interconnected subterranean passageways, guided only by the footmarks from the past. All the while, I was still greeted by the occasional wet breeze that would flow through them, like cold breaths exhaled by the earth itself. While under normal circumstances, I might have found them refreshing to my pained and stressed body as I continued on, They left a haunting impression, as their reverberance through the narrow tunnels gave off a howling-like ambience that only intensified the anxiety of the pressing situation. Eventually, I came to a large open chamber that seemed to have been carved by hand as opposed to a natural formation. Support pillars of ancient brick had been placed in several areas to support the makeshift foundation from caving in. Along the ceiling were far more of the crystalline phosphorescence that branched out along cracks within the stone itself. As I looked around the circular man-made room, I saw a vast tapestry of cave paintings made up of a type of bright neon orange material that seemed to glow due to a reaction from the natural lights up above. While they seemed to have been recently created based on the quality of the paint itself, they still took on the very basic and simplistic approach that had been used by our Neanderthal ancestors thousands of years ago. Given the complete lack of context, it was rather hard to ascertain what exactly the mural was actually depicting. All I could really make out was the fact of there being dozens of human figures with spears and swords on the ground fighting one another, while giant winged creatures that somewhat resemble the horned beasts from the framed artwork in Lecardio Carbone's office. Above the creatures was perhaps the most confusing aspect of the graffiti. There was a single eye hovering in the sky with what seemed to be lightning bolts coming out from it. Below the eye was a winged elongated diamond object that looked to be falling down from the pupil. It was as I was studying the art on the walls that I heard a scream coming from deeper within the cave. Unlike the eerie whispers of the breeze, this was clearly from the agonized mouth of a man. It echoed through the cracked labyrinth of stone, leaving a haunting howl that remained until it finally dissipated. When I snapped towards the direction of it, I could see another passageway leading out of the chamber. Above it, more of that unknown language from the Book of the Other Light was adorned above it in that same glowing paint. I stood there frozen in place, trying desperately to convince myself that I had just imagined it. Yet right as my rapid heartbeat had just begun to settle, it came again, yet this time it was the anguished cries of a woman. As my mind instantly went right towards the thoughts of my mother coming from it, I was left with no other choice but to follow. The venture down into the deeper depths of the tunnel networks did nothing but add to the terror of the situation. These walls now all appeared to be man-made. It was like walking through the Paris catacombs, except for the fact that all of the bones that lined the panels of rock had been carved out of it. Skulls of stone stared back at me with glowing geodes buried deep within their eye sockets. Along the journey, the screams continued to build up more and more, now accompanied by a fierce wind that grew stronger with each passing second. Eventually, it became almost as difficult as walking through a hurricane itself, making it a struggle just to take another step forward. How anyone could possibly have made it through this was a complete mystery. The air was loud and sharp, dulling every single one of my senses. Having to brace my eyes with my elbow, I continued into the howling abyss blindly. Without any warning, I passed over the last step expecting another one. Losing my balance, I fell forward, bracing myself to hit the stone ground hard. But rather than any kind of rock, the ground crunched beneath me as if made of twigs. Almost instantly, the wind died down to that of a gentle breeze. I knew that I must have begun to suffer from the obvious concussion I had obtained from falling down the stairs, because the sight before my eyes would have been impossible in any other circumstance. With the mouth of the cave behind me, I came to find that I was now standing outside. While a massive wall of pure rock stood behind me, as I followed it up higher, I saw a shroud of pitch-black clouds that covered the entire sky. Bright flares of orange and yellow flashed overhead beyond them, followed by distant rumbles of alien thunder. For a long while, I was just in this state, stunned in bewilderment at where I now found myself. That state of contusion was only exacerbated when I looked down at the ground around me. As ridiculous as it sounds, I was standing in the middle of a large cliff that fell off at about 20 feet on either side of myself. The drop-off must have been thousands of feet, because what lay below could only be described as some kind of colossal city that spread outwards as far as the eye could see. While it was hard to fully make out its features, due to both the distance and the poor lighting of the landscape, the flashes of diluted lightning up above allowed me to see the silhouettes of massive spires and towers that had been erected all throughout this strange and dark metropolis that was both under and far beyond the earth. The ground on which I was standing was blackened and crunched beneath my feet, and gave off a foul odor like that of rotten burned meat. Looking forward down the path, the barrier of stone behind me curved along and formed a colossal ring that stretched out to a diameter of at least 20 miles long. This cylindrical coffin of stone contained everything within view and rose up through the mask of cloud cover up above. The cliff I was on was just one of 11 others, which were spaced out evenly along the inner perimeter of the cyclopean ring of impossible architecture, and then converged together to form the top of a large mesa that stood in the center, towering over the city of shadows below. Along the central plateau was what looked to be the flickers of a bonfire, so large it could be seen from miles away. Gushes of emerald-green flames lapped up in the air, while a tower of black smoke rose up to join the ocean of dark clouds in the sky. I walked towards it for what could have been hours, even days, or maybe even just a few minutes. Time didn't seem to have the same effect as it did within the relative dilution of existence we have grown accustomed to. Not once did I grow hungry or thirsty, and the weariness on my body and mind remained as it had since I had awoken from my fall in the cave behind me. The air was foul and unwelcoming, as if the entire atmosphere of this place was solely composed of the final breaths taken by the sick and ill before they passed from the land of the living. The closer I got to the center, the more I could see shifting forms in front of the fire that looked more and more like several interconnected rings of people moving and almost dancing in circles. While the cries of terrified screams had completely faded away ever since I stepped foot here, the sounds of growing drums erupted in uneven intervals, all of them coming from my destination. Through the blazing stars above, the Father's eyes see all, yet the light of the darkest sun shines on, bringing those in its grasp to fall. As I heard the twisted whisper of a voice, I turned around quickly to see who had been behind me, yet I found no one. For below the lake which burns the scorned, the final price is paid, yet those who praise the other light in the null beyond are laid. As I continued to circle around, I realized that the whispers weren't coming from around me, but that they were coming from within me. It was like thinking a thought that wasn't mine at all, yet that wasn't all. While I wanted to just turn back and leave this insane illusion of a place, my instincts now ordered me to continue forward. It's almost as if I was helpless to keep trudging on, and that whatever bid those thoughts entry into my mind now told it where to go. It was like simply being locked within the confines of some nightmarish amusement park ride, and simply riding along for its duration. As I came to the crest of the enormous cyclopean center of this strange world, there were hundreds of individuals, all dressed in white robes adorned with exotic golden outlines and markings. They all danced around an impossible green bonfire with flames that lapped up half a mile into the sky, flames that gave off no heat at all, rather a cool Arctic breeze. The very sight of so many individuals instantly made me wonder how isolated my mother's congregation actually was. If the other 11 spokes leading away from this platform operated the same as the one I had arrived by, then they may very well somehow lead to other stairways to foreign lands. Not wanting to draw any attention to myself for the moment, I simply stood there watching this strange ritual before my eyes that still struggled to take in exactly what it was they had been watching since I arrived here. The ritualistic dancing came to a sudden halt all at once without the slightest sign or signal. Now silent and still, they all looked towards the column of flames. As I struggled to see through the cloaked crowd, 12 individuals dressed in crimson robes took their places on 12 pedestals that circled the base of the fire. They looked outwards towards the rest of the members of this congregation. I have led you all in worship. In every tongue I have preached the gospel of the other light. As they spoke, they did so in perfect unison of one another. I could make out some women in this smaller group of elevated leaders, and some with accents that made it clear that English was not their dominant language. I have told you of the coming time in which those on righteousness shall be called from the face of the earth. I have told you of the coming day in which the truth of your Lord shall be revealed to you. My devout brothers and sisters, that day has come. With that, the crowd clapped and cheered with a great resounding reverence for those which spoke. For many have seen glimpses of God, yet all have been deceived. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of those who follow the prophet of Muhammad, the self-proclaimed ruler of heaven and earth, is not God. Amen, uttered the crowd together. The one who sits atop the great white throne now is neither creator nor savior. They are not the father of all creation. They are only the father of lies. So it was, so it is, so it shall always be, chanted the congregation. Then came a great rumbling from overhead. As I looked up, I saw streams of aurora-like colors flowing just below the dark cloud cover. Slowly they came together in the sky directly above us, forming a void of glistening prismatic light. But behold, for I have seen the very face of the true Almighty. As the heads of this faith spoke again, the individuality of their voices began to shift to a more unified tone, almost as if there was one voice behind all those mouths. I was there in the holy city, amassed with the multitude of saints. For while the light of the throne gave an illumination of lies over all creation, the other light shined with truth. It was this light that challenged the authority of the deceiver. It was this light that dared to show the truth. Suddenly there was yet another quake that growled through the air. The glowing void up above began to pulse with every word that reverberated along the glowing flames. And behold, there was a great war in heaven as the disciples of the light rose up against the throne. Rejoice, my beloved, for his might was that like a great dragon that shook the false paradise. Yet what was the response from the so-called Heavenly Father? Did he smite the great dragon? Did he extinguish the other light which opposed his own? No, for he had not the power to do so, for he was not truly all-powerful. He simply cast him out along with us, his rightful followers. Yet that light shines on brothers and sisters. That light is coming again. The reply that came to this was much greater than before. The words of the gathered hundreds now only served as background noise to the cacophony that came from below. The abyss shall not smother his light. Rise up, O ye of Babylon, for the dragon shall rise up once more, and those bathed in the fire for their faith in him shall rise up with him to smite the unworthy. Those voices came from the dark city beneath the plateau with a strength like rushing water echoing in the lost, unknown regions of the earth. From the sound of it there must have been millions down there, their voices carrying up with a strength as strange as the city of which they inhabited. Without warning, the towering green flames suddenly coalesced into a solid beam of emerald light that shot up into the sky and connected with the void of prismatic colors up above. It was then that lightning began to explode through the obsidian clouds, although almost in slow motion rather than flashes of momentary cracks of light. They arched over the black sky in sporadic bolts as a defining electric buzz filled the air as opposed to a rumbling of thunder. That was when the glowing, pulsating orb began to be obscured. While at first I thought that something was in front of it, a moment later I realized that something was coming through it. In our world, we are trained to see things through the veil of rationality. We are raised early on to look upon the world through reason and logic, but I must say that all those years of indoctrination into the church of scientific understanding flew right out the window as I watched what transpired next. Descending through the clouds an orb of light was an immense, elongated diamond nearly the size of a skyscraper. Carved along its glassy-like surface were glowing crimson runes and symbols that were made ancient long before the very formation of time and space itself. As it slowly lowered itself towards us, the crowd of the congregation cheered and lifted their arms in praise while the roars of maniacal cries of worship and glee howled along the unknown city streets below. As it stopped a few hundred feet above the rocky mesa, it brought with it the kind scorching heat reserved only for the desolate rotting skeletal remains in the heart of a great and blistering desert. The 12 priests atop their platforms then began to levitate off of them, their arms outstretched. "I am Legion," they said together, "many in one, one through many." With that, the green fiery beam dissipated into nothing. Then the 12 individuals conjoined together above the bonfire pit. While the rest of the congregation cheered on, I watched in horror as their hovering bodies morphed and melted together. Their unbound forms of liquid flesh merged and blistered in their transfiguration to the point where not a single feature in their previous individual bodies could be recognized. From this floating mass came 4 pairs of black wings. Along the wings came 2 eyes upon each of them. Within the center of this winged form, a bubbling single eye like that of a serpent broke through the molding flesh. As the beating reassigned eyes from the 12 priests looked on over the rest of the congregation, the massive one in the center seemed to be looking directly into my soul. "Behold, he who gives you your strength, he who will set atop his throne upon his final victory," the thing demanded. For a moment there was complete silence.